I call the meeting of the Urbana Historic Preservation Commission to order. Could we have roll call, please?
Mr. Dossett,
Here.
Mr. Metcalf,
Present.
Ms. Novak,
Here.
Ms. Pagliuso,
Here.
Mr. Seiler, Mr. Shepherd, and Ms. Smith.
We have a quorum. We have no changes to the agenda, so the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of our meeting of December 2nd. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes?
I move approval of the minutes.
Pardon me. I'd like to add, under staff present, could we add Tim Hodson, web mapping intern? 'Cause
Yes.
He came and gave that presentation. His parents are on there, under others present.
Kim, do you accept the change?
I do.
And do we have a second from Scott?
I'll second.
Second from Gina. All those in favor signify by saying aye, please. Aye.
Aye.
Same
Aye.
sign for no. Approved unanimously for the minutes. Next item is written communications.
We have supplied a list of communications. Most of them are relevant to the public hearing today, so would you like me to read them now or as part of the record for that case?
Let's save it for part of the record for the
Okay.
hearing.
The only other one that is not related to that case is an email from Ms. Wachter regarding a proposed bus shelter at Buena Vista Court. Unless Kevin wanted to do that, I will report on that. MTD is proposing not a bus shelter, but a bus stop at the location on Springfield near Buena Vista Court. And it requires only a sign and a concrete pad within the parkway. So I couldn't find any reason why this body would need to be involved in that. There isn't any implications, nor is it even adjacent to the historic district.
And have you responded to the email then? Or?
If not, it's going to happen tomorrow. We did ask that that be done today.
Okay. All right, thank you. Next item is audience participation. If anyone would like to speak on something other than the proposed nomination of 611 West Elm Street, now is the time to do that. If you want to speak about the landmark, we're going to do that later as part of the public hearing, which is more effective. Is there anyone who wants to speak about another preservation matter not related to 611 West Elm Street? I see no interest. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is continued public hearings. I reopen case number HP-2015-L-01, a request by Brian Adams to designate the Stephen S. Henson House located at 611 West Elm Street as a local landmark. I would like to first review the procedure and how we'll get through the hearing. This is based on our bylaws that were last revised on November 5th, 2014. First, staff will present the case. Second, then the nominator, Mr. Adams, will introduce evidence and present evidence. Next will be an opportunity for the opponent, property owner, to cross-examine Mr. Adams. Then other proponents will have a chance to speak. Opponents will have an opportunity to ask questions of proponents. And then opponents, starting with the property owner, will have the the ability to speak and present evidence. The nominator may then cross-examine the property owner, and then others who have relevant information as opponents will be able to speak. Proponents. During that time, then, commissioners also will have the ability to ask questions of people who are presenting. We will then have a summary. If the nominator wants to present a summary of the petition, questions from the commission may be directed to the applicant, staff, or public at any time. And then we will close, not close, but we will stop the public participation component and speak among ourselves then for final consideration of the landmark application. So as a reminder to the audience, some of you were here prior to the sign-in sheet on the back table. If you get a chance for the record of the meeting, would you please take time to sign the sign-in sheet on the back? Also, if during the course of the meeting when you're speaking, we also need you to sign in on a paper that's up at the front table as well. So we'll start with Kevin Garcia and the staff report.
Actually, before Kevin starts, I just wanted to remind you of a few things that you should consider during the public hearing portion. Because this is a public hearing, please do not consider any materials, information, or communications received outside of this formal hearing process. If you have received any communications that we haven't already passed out and you would like to produce it or introduce it as part of the evidence, you can do that during the public hearing so that you can consider it. Any decision reached by the Preservation Commission must be based solely on the evidence presented during this formal hearing. The nominator and any opponents, as stated already, shall have the opportunity to cross-examine any witness allowed to offer testimony. Upon reaching a decision, the Commission should acknowledge that they did not rely on any materials, information, or communications received outside of the formal hearing process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Laurie. Okay, so this is an application that was submitted on October 16th of last year by Brian Adams to designate the house at 611 West Elm Street. You can see the location of the house in Exhibit A in your memo. I've also pulled it up here on the screen. Is to designate this as a local historic landmark. The property owner is Hunsinger Enterprises Incorporated. This public hearing was opened on December 2nd of last year and continued to tonight at the written request of the property owner. At this public hearing, HPC should take comments from the nominator, the owner, and any other parties who wish to be heard, and then should consider all written communications received prior to or during this hearing. It will be the responsibility of the nominator to provide evidence of the suitability for historic landmark status, as well as documentation of such evidence. In this case, the property owner has not consented in writing to the nomination, and as such, the HPC shall recommend either approval or denial of the application to the Urbana City Council, and then it will be up to the City Council to then determine whether to designate the property or not. The property owner is allowed to file a valid protest against the landmark designation, and if that is the case, then it would require a 2/3 majority vote of the City Council. If they do not protest, then it would just require a simple majority. Now, as in all landmark cases, should the application be approved, the owner would have to get a certificate of appropriateness from the Historic Preservation Commission for any future exterior changes to the property, which would include demolition. For a little background, there are some cases that are related to this property. Recently, in case DRB 2015-01, this property, pardon me, let me back up. So this property is located in the mixed office residential zoning district, which has a development review board that oversees site plan review. On August 17th last year, an application for site plan approval was submitted to the MOR Development Review Board for this property, and the plan proposed the demolition of the house and the creation of a 3-story, 5-unit apartment building on the site. Also, as part of that case, because the property is immediately adjacent to the Ricker House, which is an Urbana landmark, the Historic Preservation Commission was asked to review and provide comments on the proposed development. On September 30th of last year, the Development Review Board approved the proposed development subject to 4 conditions designed to mitigate the negative impacts on the Ricker House that is adjacent. This house, 611 West Elm Street, is also on the city's demolition delay list, which was enacted back in 2007 to encourage the identification and designation of additional historic landmarks within the city of Urbana. And what that demolition delay list does, if you're on that, or if a property is on that, it prohibits demolition permits from being issued for a period of 45 days after a permit is applied for. During that 45-day period, properties can be nominated for landmark designation, In this case, a demolition permit was applied for on September 8th of last year, and we received, as I said earlier, this application for landmark designation on October 16th, which was within the 45-day period. So until the current case is resolved, no demolition can take place on the property. There are several nearby local landmarks which you can see on Exhibit A. Apologize to the audience, this image on the screen isn't terribly easy to see or read. But as I've said, immediately to the south is the Ricker House. Down on the opposite end of the street, you have the Buena Vista Court Historic District, which is a local district and on the National Register of Historic Places. You have the Bills House at 508 West Elm. You have the Freeman House and the Sutton House at 502 and 504 West Elm as well. In 2010, there was a proposal to create a city council goal to encourage the creation of a historic district on Elm Street between Buena Vista and Cedar Street. So that proposal would have gone from roughly here, if you can see that, over a few blocks or to a couple blocks east. At that time, staff did some outreach and tried to see if there would be owner support for that. At the time, there wasn't sufficient support, but city staff will continue to make efforts to complete that goal for a district that would be that would not include this property that we're discussing today. In that, I should point out. Okay, for the property in question, so the house at 611 West Elm Street was built around 1902 or 1903 for Stephen S. Henson, who moved to this house in Urbana from Douglas County in 1903. Mr. Henson died the following year in 1904, and the house remained in the family until sometime after 1910, switched hands between 1910 and 1920, and then since 1970 it's been used as a rental property. This house does have many intact characteristics of the Dutch Colonial Revival architectural style, it's a subset of the Colonial Revival style that is defined by the presence of the gambrel roof. Let me pull up an image of the property to show that. So you can see it clearly has a gambrel roof. This house has a cross gambrel that runs east to west along here as well. That I think you can see in, yeah, you can definitely see in other images. So, pardon me. Some other characteristics of the Dutch Colonial Revival style are the second story shed dormer window, which you can see up here and better in this image. And also I think the cladding, it's clapboard on the bottom and shingle on the second story, which is also characteristic of many Colonial Revival houses. So as with many other older buildings, this house has undergone some alterations over time. Some apparent changes are the enclosure and the conversion of the original porch into a building addition with there's a vestibule in there and a bedroom as well. Over on the east side of the house, there's this staircase that has been erected as well, and on the back there's a small addition that's been added to. So in order to meet, or in order to be classified as a landmark and to be designated as a landmark, properties must meet one or more of seven possible criteria in order to qualify. The application states that 611 West Elm Street meets two of the seven criteria, those being criteria A and C, which I'll discuss in a second when I run through all of the seven criteria. I want to point out that in evaluating individual landmark nominations, these landmark criteria should only be applied to the property in question, and the historic significance of surrounding properties or of the neighborhood as a whole is really only relevant insofar as the nominated property contributes to these surroundings by meeting the evaluation criteria for an individual landmark. So I will try to somewhat quickly go through the designation criteria and discuss how this house does or does not meet those criteria. So criterion A is one that was claimed in the application, and that is that the house has significant value as part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage of the nation, state, or community. Now in the application, which you all have attached to your memo, the application provides a very thorough summary of the early social and economic development of the West Urbana neighborhood and the important role that West Elm Street played in the early history of the city. You can read that in historical significance in Exhibit B. The application does not, however, indicate how this property, how 611 West Elm Street, contributed to the early development of the city or of the neighborhood or of the street. In addition, there's not much mention in the application going beyond the years of the 1880s, and the house was built in 1902, so it's not too clear from the application how 611 West Elm Street would have had significant value during the historically significant period that the application describes. There's also no real evidence presented to indicate that the original owner, Stephen S. Henson, who the house was built for, or his family, there's really no evidence that shows how they played a prominent role or a significant role in the history of the nation, state, or Urbana. Most of the information about Mr. Henson is about his life prior to moving to Urbana. City staff recommends a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify under criterion A, as it does not have significant value as part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage of the nation, state, or community. Sorry, that's a mouthful. Criterion B is that the property is associated with an important person or event in national, state, or local history. There's no evidence presented in the application, nor have staff found any to indicate that this property is associated with an important person or event. So we therefore recommend a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify under criterion B, as there is no indication that this property is associated with an important person or event. Criterion C was also, or the application stated that 611 West Elm Street met criterion C, and that it is representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type inherently valuable for the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials while retaining a high degree of integrity. I noted in the memo that for the purpose of evaluating this criterion, we used the definition of integrity that's found in the City of Urbana's Historic Preservation Plan, which is that historic integrity is the authenticity of a property's historic identity, evidenced by the survival of physical characteristics that existed during the property's prehistoric or historic period. And the definition's longer, but I won't read the whole thing. We also referred to Section 8, how to evaluate historic integrity of a property in the National Register Bulletin, titled How to Apply the National Register Criteria for Evaluation, which you have in Exhibit C. Our criteria do differ slightly from those of the National Register, but this document does provide good guidance on the qualities of historic integrity that Urbana's definition of integrity refers to. So for this criterion, this is a two-part test. The first part of the test is that the property must represent the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type, and the second part is that it must retain a high degree of integrity. The application states that 611 West Elm Street does meet this criterion, and that it is a unique local example of the Dutch colonial revival style that retains a high degree of integrity. As I mentioned during the introduction, the house at 611 West Elm Street does exhibit and retain many characteristics of the Dutch colonial revival style, including the aforementioned cross gambrel roof and the second-story shed dormer. It also has double hung windows and the cladding that I referred to earlier. It's common on many types of colonial revival houses. There are other architectural details that are not necessarily exclusive to the Dutch colonial revival style, but do contribute to this property's character. These include, I know I have images of these. These include things like the dental molding around the top of the porch, and that's also also at the top of the shed dormer and the first story bay window. The bay window is also an architectural feature, and there are decorated gable ends with fan-shaped attic windows. One of those you can see here. This is on the east side of the house. There's also one on the west side of the house. We looked at the city's historic property surveys, and according to these surveys, there are at least, there are 50 other Dutch colonial revival style houses in the West Urbana neighborhood, and there's a sort of legible map that's also in the that's also part of the memo that shows in green the location of all those Dutch colonial revival houses. The property at 611 West Elm has a front-facing gable, which was common among the earlier wave from around 1895 to 1915 of the Dutch colonial revival style. After that, the gambrel roof went to an east-west orientation. So 20 of these properties have the front-facing or the older style of the gambrel roof. So we looked at all of those just as an example of other properties in the neighborhood. So I'll show some images which are also in your memo, but you'll notice that a lot of these houses do share a lot of or similar characteristics with 611 West Elm Street. So for example, actually the first house here, it may be a little hard to see, but this first house, 205 West Illinois Street, has the same pattern of cladding with the clapboard on the first floor and then the shingle cladding on the top story. This one also has a decorative fan window in the gambrel end that 611 West Elm has. A lot of these houses have a cross gambrel roof, like 611 West Elm. Sorry, some of these images are hard to see because things are in the way. A lot of these houses, the vast majority of these houses do have porches that are intact and weren't enclosed, and you will note that those are I think a key feature of some of these houses. Okay, that's probably enough showing of images. So we feel that in comparing 611 West Elm Street to these other Dutch colonial revival houses and just the style in general, that 611 West Elm Street does meet the first part of the two-part test for Criterion C, and it does exhibit many of the characteristics of the style. And I will note that most of these features do appear to be original. It doesn't seem like the house has undergone, with the exception of the front porch area, it doesn't seem like most of these details have undergone any sort of alteration over the years. The building form, the roof line, the siding, the bay window, the dormer window, the dental molding, and the gable ends with those fan-shaped windows all appear to be intact. However, one feature that is really character defining, as you will have noticed on some of those images that I just went through, is the front porch. And that's not true just for Dutch colonial revival houses. It's a character defining feature for many houses. Preservation brief number 45 from the National Park Service begins by stating that few architectural features evoke more romantic notions or do more to define a building's historic character than the American porch. And later they say, alter or remove the porch, and a historic building or streetscape can lose its visual integrity and historic authenticity. So, to determine whether 611 West Elm Street retains a high degree of integrity, which is required to meet that second part of the two-part test for Criterion C, it's really important to consider how well the house now communicates its historic integrity now that the original porch is missing and has been replaced with what's essentially a room addition on the front facade of the house. If you look at Exhibit B, page 16, and Exhibit C, pages 1 and 2, I think I have images of those. Let me pull those up. So this is Exhibit B, page 16, and this is a photo of the house. I'm not sure exactly when it was taken, but this is the house with obviously the original porch intact. And when you compare that to, say, this image, I think there is a difference. There's definitely a difference there. And I think that it detracts, the porch replacement detracts from the original character of the house, and significantly diminishes its historic integrity. The addition does, it's not totally out of character in that it has the same type of cladding. They somewhat match the foundation. It's an all brick foundation, as the rest of the house is. But they replace the original front steps with these massive concrete steps, which I think there's a better picture of those here. And it has modern windows and this door, which does not have much character to it. The only thing that was really retained from the original porch is basically the entablature and the roof. It seems like everything below it, if we go back to the original image of the house, the columns, the piers, the lattice work under here, pretty much everything else has been removed and replaced with a wall and a foundation. Also, the porch takes up about a third of the entire front facade when you look at the building from Elm Street. which I think is a key consideration to think about. In addition to this front porch addition, nearly all of the original windows have been replaced with vinyl windows. And the only windows that I saw at the house that appeared to be original were two horizontally shaped windows. So this window here, and then there's another horizontal window on the west side of the house that appears original. Also, I think this one up top in the attic is probably original as well, but believe that the rest of the windows are all vinyl replacement windows. And the replacement of all of those windows further diminishes the integrity, the historic integrity of 611 West Elm Street. So for these reasons, for the window replacement and the front porch replacement, staff concludes that the house at 611 West Elm Street does not retain a high degree of integrity as required by Criterion C, and we recommend a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify under Criterion C, as it is representative of the distinguishing characteristics of the Dutch Colonial Revival architectural style, but does not retain a high degree of integrity due to the replacement of the front porch and the replacement of most of the original windows with vinyl windows, both of which significantly impact the integrity of the building. For Criterion D, that is that the house is a notable work of a master builder, designer, architect, or artist whose individual genius has influenced an area. The application does not claim that the house meets this criteria. It does state that it is possible the house was designed by Joseph Royer, but does not present any evidence that this is the case. City staff therefore recommends a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify under Criterion D, as the designers and builders are unknown. Criterion E is that the house is identifiable as an established and familiar visual feature in the community, owing to its unique location or physical characteristics. This criterion refers to a property having a visually distinctive location, such as being at the terminus of a street, located on a public square or a park, up on a hill in a prominent point, or with a unique and identifiable roof line. City staff recommends a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify under Criterion E, as it is not identifiable as an established and familiar visual feature in the community. Criterion F is that it has character as a particularly fine or unique example of a utilitarian structure. I won't read the rest of that. Staff recommends a finding that 611 West Elm Street does not qualify with this criterion, as it is not a utilitarian structure. And finally, Criterion D is that the house is located in an area
Is that Criterion G? I'm sorry, I thought I heard D. Did you mean G?
I think I did say D. Criterion G, I already went through D. Thank you. Is that the property is located in an area that has yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. It does not appear that 611 West Elm Street is in an area that would yield important information. So we recommend a finding that it does not qualify under Criterion G, as the area around 611 West Elm Street has not yielded and does not appear likely to yield any archaeologically significant information. So in your memo, we have provided a summary of findings, of recommended findings based on what I just went through. I will not read through each of these. They are in your memo. But I will state the options that are available in this case. So in case HP 2015L-01, the Historic Preservation Commission shall find whether or not the nomination meets one or more of the criteria for designation as a local landmark, and recommend that the Urbana City Council approve the application to designate the property as a local landmark, or recommend that the Urbana City Council deny the application to designate the property as a local landmark. In either case, the HPC should include findings of fact in their motion, which should summarize the Commission's justification for finding that the nomination either does or does not meet the relevant criteria. This requires a majority vote of members present and voting, but with not less than 3 affirmative votes. Based on the analysis and the memo that you have in front of you, staff recommends that the HPC find that the landmark nomination for 611 West Elm Street does not conform to the landmark criteria, and therefore recommends denial of the application. That concludes my report, and I will take any questions.
Perhaps I should also add the number of communications that we've received after producing the memo, since some are attached to the memo, but we received several others since then. I will just summarize those here. We've received emails in support of the landmark designation from Robin Keratin, K.S. McKinn, Stuart Martin, Becky Mead, 2 individual emails from Gail Walden, Eunice Weech, a new one received late today, Sherry Brewer. We've received communications in opposition of the nomination from Mr. Joseph Wetzel, who was representing CIRPP, and we also received the owner's memorandum in opposition. Other communications related to the case, 1923 and amended 1945 Sanborn map submitted by the chair, Ms. Novak, and also is an excerpt from the Urbana zoning ordinance, which is section 12-5 for historic landmarks, which outlines the criteria. There was another email communication that was brought to my attention today by a commissioner. It was received prior to this case being a case, before an application was received. So if that commissioner would like me to introduce it, I can. I will need to go print it, however, before I can show it to you. So I'll leave that up to her.
Yeah, I forwarded you an email that I found from October that was sent to the HPC by Alderman Jacobson. And he was talking about the context of 611 West Elm as far as the other historic properties in that neighborhood.
Do you want it included?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love that.
When there's a break, I will run into
Absolutely. Thank you, Lori.
Are there any questions of Kevin just regarding the staff report? Ma'am.
Kevin, you mentioned that there were 50 examples of similar properties, and you pulled up that map. Do we know how many of them have applied and or been denied of some form of historic preservation designation?
To my knowledge, and it might be faulty knowledge since I've only been here a couple of years, but to my knowledge, I don't think that any of those other properties have had nominations
Okay.
for designation.
And is it correct that there are 2 that are on the 100 most significant buildings?
There are, yes, the one at 605 West Oregon and one at 702 West Pennsylvania are on the 100 most important buildings list.
Any other questions of Kevin? Gina?
Yeah, I have one. So of the 2 buildings that are on the 100 most significant list, do they have, I know that they're similar to 611, but do they have the exact same kind of features that 611 has? Do they have the fanned window with the 3 layers of shingles and the spike at the top? And I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, are those characteristics of those 2 houses the same as 611?
I think one thing I noticed from looking at all of the different Dutch colonial revival houses is I think they each have sort of a mix of different architectural features. So I think they all have, I don't think any 2 are going to be the same. But that probably goes for most houses that aren't in a subdivision or something. So.
Did you have images of those? It might be helpful to show
I do.
those.
Yeah, I have. Well, I have an image of this, of the one at 605 West Oregon. I didn't include 702 West Pennsylvania, the Hieronymus House, because that had the side-facing gambrel roof. So I only included the front-facing gambrels.
Any other questions for Kevin?
I want to go on the record that I'm a member of the MOR Design Review Board, and I was present at the September 30th public hearing meeting where we reviewed the request by Kevin Hunsinger for the development of a 5-unit development apartment building at 611 West Elm. This meeting was prior to the October 16th application by Brian Adams to designate the Henson House at 611 West Elm as a local landmark. And at that meeting, I heard testimony from the owner, the owner's representative, and the public regarding this project and its future use.
Thank you. Any other questions for Kevin? If not, thank you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks.
Next, we will hear from the nominator, Brian Adams. And for everyone who participates from here on out, I'd like to remind you that the directive of the commission is to consider whether a property is eligible for any of the criteria. And so I urge you all to keep comments as focused on the criteria as possible.
And I am putting the criteria at each table.
Okay, so there are copies of the 7 criteria at each table. Should anybody need to reference those when you're speaking. Brian.
One second. My name is Brian Adams. I submitted the nomination for this property. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide some information on how I came to the decision that this is probably a historically valuable asset to the community. So basically, I did nominate it on the basis of 2 of the criteria. The first that I indicated was that I considered a significant value as part of the social heritage of the community. That basically comes off of the first checkbox on the application. And in order to explain how I came to that decision, I'll just give a little bit of a summary of the history of West Elm Street in Urbana and why I think that this particular criteria is applicable. West Elm Street is one of the oldest streets in Urbana. It shows up on the original 1833 plat of the city. So it goes back to the very founding days of the community. Over time, as the city grew, it expanded farther west towards Busey Street with a series of additions at different periods of time. Basically, moving from Ray Street, which is, I believe, where West Elm Street begins, the bulk of the architecture there was devoted to city civic buildings. There was a fire department in the 100 block. And as you get farther to the west, residential structures became more and more common. So there was this progression from a very civic, urban downtown setting to a more residential setting towards the west. And not only that, but as you got towards the 400, 500 block of West Elm, this was an area that was occupied by a lot of the movers and shakers in the community, people who were successful businessmen, who had established some of their residences on large lots. These were very important people. So this was an area that attracted a lot of the important, again, movers and shakers in, not only in Urbana, but in Champaign County, the larger community itself. 502 West Elm, a current landmark, was built by the widow of Royal Sutton, who established a very successful brickyard in Urbana in the 19th century. The house at 504 West Elm, the Joseph Royer designed Freeman Mansion, built around the same time as the Henson House. Freeman was married into the Busey family, a very important family in the community, and he himself was a very important businessman in town. So this was an area of West Elm that attracted important people. Now Stephen Henson may not be someone who has the familiarity as the Buseys or the Suttons or the Freemans or the Buseys, but nevertheless, he was another person who, even though he spent a lot of his life in Douglas County, he did own property in Champaign County, and he owned several hundred acres in Champaign and Douglas counties. And he may not have been a banker, a lawyer, a doctor, but people like Henson were just as important to the community as these sorts of professional people. These were the people that, the early people who turned the prairie over into farmland, who contributed to the economic success of the county. So just to discredit him based on the fact that not much is known about him and that he didn't early in his life live in our community doesn't mean that he didn't have some role in the growth and the prosperity of Champaign County. Now I know I didn't nominate it based on the connection with Henson, but I think that does make it an important aspect of the cultural, economic, and social heritage of the area. We heard a lot about, so going down to the next criteria that I considered when I submitted the application, the architectural characteristics. I still think that even though this house has some integrity issues, it still is a unique example of the colonial revival style. I made it clear, I believe in the nomination, that I was referring to the context of West Elm Street. I've lived in this community since 1988, and I'm aware that there are a lot of Dutch colonial structures in the neighborhood, some in neighborhoods that time has been kinder to. So the fact that there is one unique example of a Dutch colonial house in historic West Elm Street, I think makes it all the more valuable and all the more worthy of landmarking. Just going back to the cultural, economic, the civic value of the connection with Henson, there have been other people in the community on West Elm Street. For example, Clark Robinson Griggs, his house used to sit between the Sutton Mansion and the Freeman Mansion. It burnt down in the 1980s, but Griggs was the person who brought the University of Illinois to this community. He started his life out as a merchant during the Civil War. Again, another person who contributed to the civic and the economic development of the community, but didn't have the high title of doctor or something like that. And another example would be B.F. Harris, who made his fortune in Champaign County as a raising and selling livestock. Another person who was more of a farm-oriented individual, but contributed to the economic development and prosperity of the community through his involvement with agricultural pursuits rather than more professional pursuits. So again, I think those are important aspects to take into account when we consider the presence of this structure in this on West Elm Street. So there were some other things I wanted to bring up, but basically in terms of why I nominated this building, those are the things I took into account. So if you have any questions for me, I can answer them. Or
Commissioners, any questions of Mr. Adams? No questions. Next, yes.
So, Brian, you've said a couple of times, and thank you for being here, by the way. You've said a couple of times that there are unique features to this house, and a lot of your nomination is based on the unique features of the house. So can you tell us what those unique features are that make this something that is above and beyond the other Dutch colonials that are in town, or the other Dutch colonials that are on Elm?
Yeah, well, I don't know, if Susan, would you be able to help me out with this a little bit? Some of the aspects that I thought were unique were I believe on the west side, there's the window that's very Baroque looking. It doesn't have it has more of a, I don't know, not medieval, but more of a Renaissance Italian-type look to it. I thought that was a unique characteristic of the house. And then on the opposite, I believe on the east side, there's at the attic, there's a very unique kind of, looked like a stained glass, not stained glass window, but leaded glass window. Those were two things that stuck out to me as sort of unique attributes that I hadn't seen in other houses of this type.
Because this situation's a little unusual, would you introduce yourself and what your role was in this, please?
My name is Susan Apple. I actually live in Champaign, but I contributed to the nomination, particularly in terms of the architectural description. Having not done a widespread study of all the other Dutch colonial houses in the area, I'm not exactly comfortable with saying, well, this is unique and this is not. I would say that there's an interesting combination or variety of features that demonstrate the relationship between the Dutch colonial and the general colonial revival, including the neoclassical qualities that are a part of that general movement toward the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. In regard to that, I would draw attention to the fan lights on the side gables, pardon me, the side gambrels, cross gambrels, as well as some of the, not just the fan lights, but the surrounds of those fan lights and that little sort of vaguely arched quality that looks like it should be made of bricks but is actually not, including that sort of semi-keystone-like feature at the top of each of those windows. The dentelated cornices are very classical, not Dutch at all particularly, but not an uncommon. This is a very eclectic period in architecture, and it draws from lots of different sources, and it mixes them all up. And for that reason, you see the variety amongst the Dutch colonial houses that were spoken of earlier. Very seldom do you see the same exact design, unless there's some sort of development of like a cookie cutter kind of arrangement. I've seen houses like that, not of this style, but little groupings of 4 or 5 houses that are almost exactly alike. Not this large particularly. At any rate, I have something in mind that has nothing to do with this particular situation. At any rate, it seems to me that this house just speaks to the Dutch colonial as a style that developed in the period in question in the late 19th, early 20th century. It would not be seen as anything but that. It is extremely characteristic. Whether it has exactly the same details as other houses or not, the variety is part of the game at the time. It also seems to me, architecturally, that while much has been made of the changing of the porch, it strikes me that the porch has, in essence, been enclosed, and that it's in exactly the same position that the porch was always in, and that if you were inclined to do so, you could restore that porch and make the house look exactly like it looked originally. It's otherwise relatively unchanged, with the exception, I suppose, of the very small, very rearmost portion of it, and the addition of a highly uncoordinated sort of staircase to what's now obviously an upper apartment, and the cutting of the door to that apartment where a window once was. They've used the opening, but they've simply enlarged it. Those kinds of things too. Certainly there are changes. They could be rectified, they could be taken back, which is perhaps not the question here, but I would lay that out as a possibility. Because the house, to me, architecturally, in terms of scale, in terms of the way that it sits within the neighborhood, is something that's important. I don't think that, despite the argument that we only should look at this house as a single entity because that's the way it's being nominated, I don't think somehow that that works, because I don't think that we look at architecture one building at a time. In this case, this building is part of a neighborhood that still consists of at least 7 buildings, if I'm reading the map correctly, possibly 8, but I think 7, that are varying in style, but of similar scale, of similar date, represent that eclecticism of the period in which they were built. And for my money, you take that corner piece out and you wreck what's left of that neighborhood. And that's what disturbs me the most, to place in the place of this house a 3-story apartment building that then is completely at odds, presumably, with everything around it, at least on that block, that is sitting right behind the Ricker House, which is a significant building, is just to alter that possible historic district in a way that just can't be fixed. Right now, there are ways that that neighborhood can be still considered part of the historic context and fabric of the city. And it just seems to me a shame to change that irreparably. Which doesn't have to do with what are the unique characteristics of this building in relation necessarily to the Dutch colonial style, but that's my overview.
One thing I noticed too in the staff report was that the terminology they used regarding the porch went from enclosed to an addition.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's an addition. I think if you look at the early Sanborn maps, the floor plan is exactly as it is today. All that's been done to the porch is it's been enclosed. So I think that does not impact the integrity in terms of a later addition to the building. I mean, it's been modified, but it
I
still
agree.
is part of the original floor plan.
I think the foundation it's a whole new foundation, it appears, below it.
That could well
It's
be.
the roof is, I think, the only remaining part,
Mhm.
if you look at it.
Yeah, but I think the general
The footprint is the
footprint
same.
of what
You
was
are
there
correct.
is more or less
The
there.
foundation does appear to be an older brick. It's a rock-faced or rusticated brick, which,
I mean, the piers are no longer there if you look at
Right.
it. I mean, it's,
Right.
whether or not they went back in or.
Yeah.
Has
Too
anybody
bad.
looked inside? I'm curious. I've never seen the inside of that space. I'm just curious whether any of that porch structure might still be lurking in there. I have no idea. It doesn't look like it from the outside. But it's
Don't
a-
know.
it's
are
a
there any
question.
other,
I was inside the house within the past couple of weeks, and I saw no evidence of those architectural features of the columns or the piers or anything. It looks like an addition.
That's
So,
not surprising
it-
from what it looks like from the outside.
yeah, and initially when I was writing the memo, I was characterizing it as an enclosed porch, but once I toured it
Hmm.
and saw up close what it was, I had to state it as I saw it, which was like an addition. So
Hmm.
but the cornice and the entablature are exactly like what was on the porch.
the form of the porch, it has the same footprint, and entablature and above appear to be intact,
Mhm.
but everything below that
Mhm.
is gone.
Are there other questions for the preparers?
I guess I just had a quick follow-up. So do we think the back porch was an addition, or is that also an enclosed porch? Because it looks like on the Sanborn map that there was an area in the back, so,
I don't know.
okay.
I'm really not sure what I recall of it, and it's been a while. It'd really be nice to have the photo there to take a look at again. It struck me that the outermost wall at the back of the house had probably been pretty recently enclosed. The door is just nothing. And I would bet that if that slight addition, thank you, appreciate that. If that slight addition is of any age, and I can't tell you how old it is, it might well have had a different kind of door. The windows strike me as being somewhat more vintage, if one could use that word. A little awkward here, yes.
Yeah.
I think there is a photograph of the back end.
Yeah, I thought I had seen that there might have possibly been piers, at least
Yeah.
on the southeast corner, and
Yeah,
that those
looking-
had been filled in with.
I'm looking at the paper copy that Brian just provided, and the exterior is clapboarded, and it has a nice fascia at the top. But the door itself, just as, I think I described it as unremarkable. It's just very ordinary. Yeah, there you go at the top on the screen. The window seems a little more of a piece with other windows, but the door is not. The door is very recent, relatively speaking. I wondered if there was some problem, that made for a quick fix back there.
Yeah, it's on the Sanborn. The Sanborn map does show a one-story rear addition, and it also, or a wing,
Mm-hmm.
and it shows these 3 angled recesses or
Mhm.
re-entrant angles, like are shown today.
It's an interesting instep kind of arrangement back there, not particularly common, I wouldn't think, but
Mhm.
I can't say how it compares to other examples of similar houses.
Are there any other questions for the form preparers, Matt?
If the features are not necessarily unique, would you consider them special?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think this house has a lot of special things about it, and though we're considering it essentially from the outside, I think some of the inside features are extremely nice too, and it just breaks my heart to think that it's just going to be knocked down for the sake of it. But that's not particularly of concern here, I understand.
Thank you.
I think when you put them all together, the features here, again, speak to this style, this time, the design of what I would think of being a very comfortable middle-class house and quite typical of that period, and one which has a lot in common with other buildings of the time and of this immediate surrounding.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the nominators? If not, then next, if you'll both stay at the front desk, please. I need you both to stay there, please. Brian,
Pardon?
I need you to stay there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Next, according to the bylaws for our procedures, is that opponents have have an opportunity to ask relevant questions in a cross-examination. So is there anyone?
My name is David Thies. I'm here on behalf of the owner, Hunsing Enterprises, and we do not have any questions.
You don't? Okay, thank you. Okay, then you may.
Thank you.
Me too.
Yes, sorry. Next, then, is an opportunity for any other proponents of the application to speak at this time. If you will come to the front, please, and sit at the table on your right as you approach. Do you wish to speak?
Yes.
Oh, if you'll come over to the table, please. Yes. And if you would sign in, I think there's a sign-in sheet too, please. And you can, either place.
I'm Linda Lorenz. I've done quite a bit of work with Brian and others on Elm Street in particular, and in thinking about preservation. I guess I have 2 thoughts. One is that without understanding how all these rules and policies work, it's unfortunate that someone is allowed to make some of the changes that have been made to these old houses before they're designated, because the damage gets done and then it's kind of too late. And the other is that the Elm Street is one of the most special streets we have in Urbana, from my point of view. And in terms of the beautiful big houses, several of which we've managed to keep and save and keep from any kind of changes or destruction, that it's not just this house, but it's the whole street it's the street with all those beautiful big houses. And to lose that is just so sad, and to have it next door to the Ricker House is also very sad. And when you think of all of the apartments that this person owns, he can really, to have this particular house and on this street and in that location go is just very, very sad. Because we have some really wonderful big old houses, and I hate to see the whole street end up with another apartment house. I'd like to see it saved.
Thank you. Are there any questions from commissioners? Thank you. Are there any other proponents that would like to speak? Please come forward. And if you would sign in also, please.
My name is Danny Otto, and for the sake of transparency, I also served on the MOR board along with Kim Smith, but we were dealing with a different set of questions and a different set of information on that. So my comments are based upon the application submitted by Brian Adams and the city staff's response, as well as what I could glean from looking at the exterior of the house. I should also be clear, I'm the owner of one of the 19 homes referenced in the appendix number H at 606 West Illinois. And that house, before I purchased it, was covered with aluminum siding. Other than the original windows, which are covered by aluminum storm windows, there's nothing left of that house other than the roof profile that would bear witness to this architectural style. Everything has been covered up, other than you can see the detail of the front window underneath the aluminum storms. I'd like to comment, since the application is only based on design criteria A and C, I'd like to comment on A, which reads significant value as part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage. I read there's an implied or between each one of those things itemized, so that any one of those is sufficient in order to meet that criteria, or more. If you gain more of them, there's more weight. And the city staff's discussion of it only discusses the social context, which Brian Adams reviewed. But the first thing that's listed there is architectural. And I think that he's made a very, very strong case, which has been supplemented by their comments a few minutes earlier, that this has architectural significance. And so I don't think it's an open and shut case that it fails on the first of the two criteria that Brian is basing his application on. I think there's a strong case that it qualifies on the first thing that's listed in the string. And if you look at the way that is written, the end of that says, or the social heritage of the nation, state, or community. So that is an implied nation or state or community, and no one would read this as if it has to have national significance in order to be qualified. So I think the city staff's discussion of this misses some of the point that Brian was making in his application. And then under C, representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type inherently valuable for the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials while retaining a high degree of integrity. The city staff divides that into two sections, references the national Section 8 of how to evaluate historical integrity of a property in the National Register Bulletin, and so on. And then it says criterion C is a two-part test. And it largely says that it meets the first part of that in the sense of the distinctive style and characteristics and so on. But then it goes on the second part, let me see. the second part of the test in the maintenance of the integrity of the building. And so, I took a look at the section of criterion C on the National Register. And it says, I'm sorry. A property important for illustrating a particular architectural style or construction technique must retain most of the physical features that constitute that style or technique. A property that has lost some historic materials or details can be eligible if it retains the majority of the features that illustrate its style in terms of the massing, spatial relationships, proportion, pattern of windows and doors, texture of the materials, and ornamentation. The property is not eligible, however, if it retains some basic features conveying massing but has lost the majority of the features that once characterized its style. So then the question is, are there features of ornamentation, texture, and so on that are clearly visible on this in spite of the fact that the porch has been enclosed and there's a staircase on the side that's not original and so on? Regarding the staircase, I would point out that further east on Elm, the two properties, 502 and 504, each are on the register and also have massive staircases. So the staircase alone is not a disqualification. And in this case, if someone wanted to use this as a single-family residence, one could remove that without any great amount of work. On the issue of the porch, I have worked on restoration, owned 7 homes that have done substantial attempts at restoration. And in a previous life working for other contractors, I've also been guilty of enclosing a few porches. And enclosed is this an addition. You can look at the roof line and the level of detail around there, and I can tell you with a high degree of probability how this was done. Before you remove the posts, you put in temporary 2x6 leaners that are staked out. I've held up multiple porches this way. You take out the posts. You put in a foundation since you're wanting to enclose it and heat it. And in some cases, I don't know, I wasn't underneath it, but the original floor is also left. You put the foundation underneath the original floor joist, floor structure, and then you filled it in with walls. And to reverse that, if someone were inclined to, one could restore that. What one really needs are round posts, and there are close copies of the original. I mean, these things are easily available through mill shops. So that porch, if one were inclined to, could be restored to the original look that the non-expert would not know that it had ever been enclosed and then reversed. When one talks about the texture and detail, when you look at the other houses of the 19, there's none of the other houses has this sort of a feature that's on the screen. This is from the city staff's photos. This fan feature with the leaded glass, there is another house at 20, one of the 19 on East Illinois has a nice degree of restoration and painting. It has a small, narrow window with the keyhole feature above. It doesn't have the large fan-shaped. It doesn't have the light. The one down in Oregon has a high degree of restoration, but it doesn't have anything similar to these sorts of windows. Most of the houses, the 19, have been closed in ways that are much more obtrusive than the closed-in porch on this one. So if you look across the street at the house, I don't want to go through all of those. It's been bricked up, to the level of windows and storm windows. And if you go through that 19, there's about 12 2 or 3 that have any degree of the texture and integrity that this house has. And one of the features that wasn't commented on, if you look at the fascia following the roof line down through here, where rather than simply having a single board, they have used the shingles to create more texture. In my looking through, none of the other houses has anything similar to that. And then the fine, the architectural term is it the entablature, that dentile form that goes across. Pardon?
Cornice.
Cornice. This is a level of detail that's lacking on the other homes. So if one wanted to take a class of students to study the Dutch colonial style, even with the closed-in porch and even with the staircase, one would find architectural details here that are not available in any of the other 19 homes. This block is still largely intact. Of course, behind this is the beautiful Ricker house. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that when the Presbyterian Church did their wing, the house behind that wing was an object of a lot of concern, and in order to get permission to do the wing, the Presbyterian Church agreed to preserve that house. They wanted to tear it down. It's now a thrift store or something. So when one looks at the south side of Elm Street from this corner property all the way down to the church, those houses are intact. And you've got the Ricker house on the north-south street. So there aren't many blocks in this neighborhood that are as intact as this block. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr. Otto? Thank you. Are there any other people who wish? Yes.
Sit here, right. I'm Carolyn Baxley. I live at 510 West Main in Urbana. My husband and I own 3 houses on Elm Street, including the Bill's house, which is a local landmark. So we're obviously very concerned about what happens on the street. Just echoing what earlier speakers have said, it was one of the most significant streets in early Urbana. And the comparison of this house to other Dutch colonials does not seem to me to be the point of this review. I was looking through the criteria again while people were speaking, and criterion A doesn't say that it has to be unique. It says that it has to have significant value as part of. It doesn't say as unique to. So I think the case has been made here quite clearly that this is one of the best examples of a Dutch colonial. It may not be the only example, but it's the one that you're considering here. You're not considering all the other Dutch colonials. And I think that it retains a high degree of architectural integrity. As far as the porch goes, our house at 510 West Main is generally considered to be one of the most historic houses in town. It was built in 1892. In fact, the 3 houses in a row in the 500 block of Main were probably built by the same builder within a couple of years of each other. And when we bought the house, the porch had deteriorated, and as probably many people do, we started taking a look at, what to do about this. And we found original footings under the porch, which had nothing to do with the porch that was on it when we bought it. So sometime between 1892 and the time we bought it in 1981, the porch had been changed at least once before. So we changed it again to be more in keeping with what we thought the 3 houses in a row would have had on it at the time. So what I'm saying is porches are fluid things. They rot easily. The columns rot, the floorboards rot, and it's not unusual to, I think, to have porches replaced. But that does not mean that this house does not retain architectural integrity. It has the footprint, it has the porch detailing, and could easily be returned to its original look. If you compare the 2 facades, the older one and the new one in your packet, it's so obvious that the house retains so much of its integrity. The other thing that I wanted to bring out is that nobody's brought up something that I just recently found out, and I found it out from Gail Walden, who lives in West Urbana, is the house is associated with someone who is unique to history, and it's not the local kind of history that we generally hear of, but it turns out that the son of Mr. Henson was the Reverend Donald Walden. And Donald Walden was very active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in 1966. He was jailed in Mississippi for his efforts. And to me, this kind of significance is certainly worthy of noting as we look at this house. I mean, he grew up in this house. He lived in this house. So I think that's kind of important. And then the other one, criterion E, we haven't talked much about that. It's identifiable as an established and familiar visual feature in the community. That's kind of vague language, but I would say that the house is certainly identifiable as a feature of Elm Street. It's a very interesting house along this block, and it is in, as Danny Otto has pointed out, it is one of a trio there that's still left virtually intact. And to take this one down and put up an apartment building, I fear would, create a domino effect, and we might lose the other 2 at some point as well. And its proximity to the Ricker House, I think, is one of the most important reasons that we need to retain it as it is. And then one final thing before I go, and that is somewhere along the way, one of the main purposes of the mixed office residential district has gotten lost, and it needs to be found again. I was a member of the Plan Commission when this zoning district was drafted and when it was adopted by the City Council, and so I can testify to its intent, and that's what seems to be lost here. One of the main purposes of it was to prevent further erosion of historic houses and to encourage the adaptive reuse of those properties by allowing offices and small retail uses along the Elm and Green Street corridors. And I would really like to encourage the HPC to meet with city staff. I think you should even consider imposing a moratorium on development in this area until this issue can be resolved, because it keeps coming up again and again, and the purpose of adaptive reuse keeps getting ignored. I think you should go back and review the original minutes of the meetings, both the Plan Commission and the City Council when this was adopted, and somehow figure out how staff can better head off cases like this that clearly are not in keeping with the most important, in my estimation, purpose of the district, to encourage adaptive reuse. So, thank you very much.
Sorry, are there any questions of Carolyn? Thank you. Are there any other people in the audience who wish to speak in favor of the application? Yes.
Hi there, I am Tom Garza. I live in Champaign. I just wanted to make a couple of really quick points. As far as criterion A goes, significant value. I think that pivots on the word significant. And as Susan pointed out a few minutes ago, no building exists in a vacuum. They're all part of their context and their location, the area that they're in, their neighborhood. And while there's very little in the history of this house maybe that really stands out as being significant in terms of its own personal history, I guarantee you if you take it away, you will see a significant void in that neighborhood that will forever and unalterably change the character of that neighborhood. So I would say in that sense it has a great deal of significant value. As far as criteria C goes, I just had a quick comment, and that is if the MOR board can accept on the new plans for the new structure that they want to put there, one of the things that was mentioned was they have some decks around there, and they said that by putting a railing around them, that sort of stands in as a porch, kind of represents a porch in terms of fitting in with the neighborhood. If they can accept that as a porch, then I think we can accept an enclosed porch that is as still being a porch and fitting in with the house. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Are there any other audience members who wish to speak in favor of the landmark application?
I'm Dan Newman. I live next door to the proposed demolition house. I live in the so-called Ricker house. I think I have a lot of feelings and thoughts about what it represents to this area of the community, especially the Elm Street area east of Kohler, if you remove this house. There are many intact houses on Elm Street. Elm Street, I think, is one of the 4 oldest streets in Urbana. And I wish you would drive down Elm Street and look at what's happening west of Kohler and compare it to what's happening east of Kohler, and see that a lot of the character of the neighborhood is intact east of Kohler. But you've asked us to stick to the criteria, and so I will attempt to stick to the criteria in hopes that both the people in favor of the proposal and people in opposition to the proposal stick to the criteria. And so with criterion C, whether the property represents distinguishing characteristics of the Dutch colonial revival style and has a high degree of integrity. Just to read this paragraph again, which is the same one that Danny Otto quoted, just to help myself stick to the criteria by making sure I'm reading the exact words. A property important for illustrating a particular architectural style or construction technique must retain most of the physical features that constitute that style or technique. A property that has lost some historic materials or details can be eligible if it retains the majority of the features that illustrate its style in terms of the massing, spatial relationships, proportion, pattern of windows and doors, texture of materials, and ornamentation. The property is not eligible, however, if it retains some basic features conveying massing, but has lost the majority of the features that once characterized its style. City staff summarized that the proposal meets criterion C with regard to all aspects except for the porch and the material of some of the windows. That's the way I understood it. So with regard to porches, the house that I live in, the Ricker house, in 1994, they tore off the whole porch and put a new porch on there. So to me, I wonder if that implies that the distinguishing characteristics of the Ricker house no longer have a high degree of integrity. I don't know where to draw the line. I understand the purpose of this commission is to use your judgment in interpreting things like this. So I think that's all I have to say.
Are there any questions for Mr. Newman? Oh, thank you. Are there any other members of the audience who wish to speak in favor of the nomination? Next, are there any opponents to the nomination who have questions of anyone who gave testimony as a proponent of the nomination?
Again, David Thies, who is here on behalf of the owner, Hunsinger Enterprises, and we have no other questions.
Thank you. Next, we have excuse me, trying to catch up. Next, we have opportunity for opponents of the application to speak, and we'll let the owner and representatives go first over on that side, please.
Good evening. My name, as I've been saying, is David Thies. I'm an attorney with the Urbana firm of Weber and Thies. Our address is 202 Lincoln Square, and we represent the owner of the subject property, Hunsinger Enterprises, and that is the property, of course, that is before you tonight in this petition. With me tonight as a representative of the owner is Kevin Hunsinger, who is the president and shareholder of Hunsinger Enterprises. And Mr. Hunsinger will speak to you in a moment as to his feelings. His request of you is that you recommend against the approval of the application for landmark status. And we'd like to explain with from a couple of different perspectives why we feel that way. With Mr. Hunsinger tonight, and here at his request are 3 individuals who will also speak to you in order to provide what we believe is relevant information. Andrew Fell is a local architect who has been retained by Hunsinger Enterprises to work on the project that had been proposed. You've heard about it discussed. That was before various other aspects of city government. Steve Whitsitt is here. He's a local real estate appraiser. And we also have with us Gary Cole, who is a landmark or a preservation attorney and preservation architect. He's one of the very few people in the country who have both of those designations, those licenses. He spends much of his professional time working with people who are working on these kinds of projects. Each of these individuals has provided to you a written report that you should have before you. We provided you with a hard copy, I believe, and earlier, I think, sent over an electronic version of that as well. And after they make their presentations, I would ask that that report be admitted into evidence. With your permission, what I'd like to do is to introduce each of the people who will speak, let them make their presentation, and then I could stay here and follow up, but then introduce the next person who will speak. And then at the close, I'd appreciate the opportunity to make some closing remarks. And we would begin, I mentioned also that there's a memorandum in opposition to the designation of the historic landmark, which you should have. I wanted to point out that the text of the ordinance that we're working with is the one that came with the petition that was served upon our client, and I know there have been some changes very recent to the ordinance. I don't think they're relevant to what we're considering here, but you'll see in the memorandum a reference to the earlier version of the ordinance that was in place prior to about October of this year. That's the one that was in place when the application was filed. The first of our speakers is Kevin Hunsinger, who is the representative of the owner. As I mentioned, Kevin is the president and shareholder of Hunsinger Enterprises, the owner of the property that is before you tonight. He grew up in the Urbana-Champaign area, now lives outside of Mahomet. And Mr. Hunsinger would like to describe the property to you. You've been hearing about it. This is the owner now telling you about the property, tell you a bit about his reasoning for objecting to the landmark, proposed historic landmark designation. Also like him to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his background, just so you can understand who the owner of the property is, what kinds of things they have done in the community in the area of their property. Mr. Hunsinger.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Hunsinger. Again, I am the owner of 611 West Elm in Urbana. I acquired the property in 2004. I have been in this business of rehabbing real estate and building real estate since 1978 at 17 years of age. Started by my father, who is a professor in electrical engineering and IEEE fellow at the University of Illinois. Started because there was no housing for students. His own graduate student was sitting in his car for weeks with no place to live. So we began this business, and I poured my entire career into this. And over the course of time, I've done, I had a period of time that I did a lot of construction from around 1991 to 2002. During that time frame, I did a significant number of rehabs, but I also did a lot of new construction. And some of that new construction was to try to take into account the character of the neighborhood. I received actually 2 separate heritage rewards per respective design heritage awards from PACA on 2 different occasions. I had a building that was taken by eminent domain from the University of Illinois at 1114 West Springfield, and I coordinated and orchestrated that not being torn down and moved it to 707 West Springfield. I also rehabbed the structure that was moved into Champaign for the Center for Women in Transition. I also rehabbed the warehouse at 301 West Water, which was a 10,000 square foot warehouse, into apartment complexes for the now deceased Jimmy Fallon. And so I've had experience with both new and old. I've done these in the MOR district. I've done these outside the MOR district. And when I bought this particular building in 2004, it was a 6-person rooming house, 6-person single-family house, whatever you would like to refer to it. I rented it to 6 people as a group. It was, when I bought it, in pretty poor disrepair. But the main structural things like roofs, mechanical systems were pretty good. I started doing some remodeling, but over the course of time, the deterioration of the interior became more extensive, and I had to start looking at doing major renovations to it. And about the same time, I was no longer able to rent it to 6 people because of ordinance through the city of Urbana, and could only handle, was only allowed to have 4 people in the structure. That then reduced my revenue and reduced my ability to make renovations, do the types of things that I would otherwise do, and what I have actually done in other buildings that I own in the general area. As time went on, the major thing started to become a problem. It needed a full roof. It needs a mechanical system completely removed so I can put a heating, air conditioning system in, because the student population will no longer tolerate no air conditioning. So you start combining those things, and I start looking into it, and I end up with a $200,000 or $300,000 bill to meet. Because also, if I start doing major renovations, I have to meet all the new code compliance, and that snowballs. And it's not just taking the porch off, because once you start doing a few of these things, it snowballs what else I have to do, because I'm making major modifications. So now I've gotten into a situation where the rehab will no longer justify the revenue that the revenue will not justify the remodeling. That's where I got. And so at that point, when I saw that that was the situation I was in, I decided that I would like to tear the building down and build a new structure. So I hired a very respected architect, Andrew Fell. He's done a lot of projects here in Urbana. I hear all kinds of good words from those who are in Urbana. That's part of why I picked him. I also dealt with him at the 301 Water Street project, and he did an amazing job of designing that building. So before I went too far, though, I've been in the MR district. I decided to go to the city staff, and I did that. And I met with Libby and John and Jeff Engstrom and 2 or 3 additional people, and kind of gave them an outline of what we'd like to do. And they looked at that and said, that looks like a project that will be beneficial to the student community and beneficial to the city of Urbana. That's what they told me. But I needed to make sure that I stayed within the guidelines of the MOR. So we worked very hard and came up with a plan that had no variances to what the MOR district requested. And we put together all of the design and came before the board and received, were granted the ability to put up this building. And at that point, I'd spent almost $10,000. $10,200 is actually what we came up with. And we were moving forward because that's what we were told we could do. I even heard at this MOR commission meeting that the Historic Preservation Committee was aware of this particular project, and I heard nothing negative. In the 11th hour, here we are, and we have it being nominated to be an historic landmark. I won't tell you, I was shocked. I spent all that time, all that effort. I get the city telling me that they're excited about it. That's basically it. By the time I got to Andrew having a more defined plan, they were excited about it. And here comes this. In the 11th hour, someone decides they can come in and commandeer my property, as far as I'm concerned. And I was surprised because of the condition of this place. It has a lot of issues. That porch is a very big issue in terms of its detraction from its historic significance. It has vinyl windows. In other historic buildings, you wouldn't probably approve someone wanting to come in and install vinyl windows in a historic building. So I asked myself, why would you take and make something a landmark if it already has them in it? It seems to me that it disqualifies it. And there are a variety of other things. I won't take the time to go through every single detail beyond the roof and the mechanicals and the windows. But I realized at that point that this wasn't really to make it a landmark. This was to use your process just to stop development. That's what I felt the petitioner was doing at this point. Not thinking this was a landmark, but just trying to stop development. And I don't think that, from what I can tell, is the purpose of historic preservation, just to simply stop any development, regardless. And I kind of came to that conclusion because I looked through this proposal by the petitioner and realized how much it's just fluff. I mean, there was pages about Urbana, but this is a landmark designation about one property, and there's very little that has anything to do with the property. It is, and was in my opinion, and I'm not a historian, so I realize that my opinion is just that, one person's opinion. So I decided that I needed to get somebody else involved, probably. So I first went out and did a little of my own research. You know, I looked through the field guide for American houses and saw that, you know, they all say there should be a porch there should be a grand entrance there, and a few things it didn't have. So I thought, that kind of supports my thoughts. I saw the overall construction problems that lended to it, but I knew in the end that wasn't going to be enough. So I actually, why we have all these people here tonight is because I've tried to put together people that I hope you respect and can realize are coming to you with an objective opinion that this is not a landmark. This is someone just trying to commandeer my property. And in doing so, they're really stealing value of my property. And I don't think that's right for one individual. One individual, they don't live in Urbana. They have no monetary involvement in this. It costs them nothing to show up, throw something against the wall, hope it sticks, and make the property owner all of a sudden scramble and try to disprove it. But that's what I'm doing, because I do believe that this is not a landmark. And so the people coming before you are then professionals in their field to discuss with you some of these specifics. And I appreciate you letting me talk to you. Sorry.
Are there any questions of the property owner? Thank you. I will remind that focusing on the criteria and things that we consider as within the ordinance would be helpful.
I understand, and that, of course, is what is this on? Is this
I think so.
Great. But as you'll hear, both from Mr. Hunsinger and also from the other individuals that we would like to present, 3 other individuals, I'm looking at your ordinance and the legal environment in which the ordinance is evaluated, and seeing things like in Criterion A, discussion of the economic heritage of the community, but the health of the economy in the community, the purpose of this ordinance, the Urbana zoning ordinance as it relates to historic preservation, giving authority to designate local landmarks and historic districts with the stated purpose of promoting the education, cultural, economic, and general welfare of the community. And then, of course, the LaSalle National Bank criteria, which is one of the legal backdrop against which this will all be measured, which talks about the extent to which the zoning restrictions diminish property values, the extent to which the diminishment of the plaintiff's property values promotes the public good, the gain to the public compared with the hardship to the property owner, the suitability to the property to the zone purposes, and finally the length of time the property has been vacant as zoned in the context of land development in the area. I look at those things and then finally realize that you are sitting as a quasi-judicial body. This is the only place I have the opportunity to present evidence. So it may not be persuasive.
Just to be clear, we don't make the final decision because the property owner objects.
Right.
So we maybe recommend one way or the other to City Council. City Council makes the decision, and so you do have another opportunity before City Council.
Not to present evidence. I'm presenting the evidence here.
He's correct. Evidence can be introduced at City Council. It then allows the other party to cross-examine that evidence, but generally speaking, all of the evidence does happen at this stage.
Okay.
So while it may not be persuasive or it may not be something that you consider going directly to the criterion, I want to have the opportunity on behalf of my client to present a broader perspective of evidence. We won't take long. I think it's pretty succinct, but I asked for the opportunity to do it. That's why we're going a bit broader than just the criterion.
Okay. And I think I'll let all 3 of you present before commissioners ask questions, if that's okay.
Sure. If that, I'll certainly defer to.
Or we'll ask along the way as well too.
It's probably easier to do it that way.
Do you have a question in the audience?
I just want clarification. When you asked, are there any questions for the property owner? Were you asking the commission if they have questions, or were you asking if the peanut gallery?
I was asking the commission if they have questions. Okay. And then there is an opportunity for, I believe, just the nominator to ask questions of the property owner and team. And that will follow after all the presentation.
So if I understand correctly, Mr. Hunsinger will sit down, but
yes.
he'll be able to come back later
yes,
to answer
absolutely.
questions. Okay. Thank you, Kevin. I'd like to introduce now Mr. Gary Cole. Mr. Cole is a historic preservation lawyer and historic preservation architect. He'll tell you a bit about his background, and then we've asked him to give his opinion as to whether the property legally meets the ordinance's stated criteria for designation as a landmark, and secondly, a bit of his observations of the ordinance itself, its breadth and vagueness, aside from specific application of the property, but obviously relevant to its specific application to the property. I've asked Mr. Cole to go into a bit of his background, the kinds of projects he's worked on, just so you have some feeling for his expertise. Mr. Cole.
Can everybody hear me okay? Mm-hmm. I have an unfortunate tendency to speak low and quickly, so if you can't understand me, please let me know. I do want to give just a very brief summary of my background so that you have an understanding that I come to you today as a preservation professional, and I can elaborate on that background a little bit so you understand the kind of things I've been involved with. As was described, I am a licensed architect and a licensed attorney. I was an architect before I was an attorney, but specifically these days I am both an historic preservation architect and an historic preservation attorney. That is part of my practice. I do other things as well. I have a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Illinois in Chicago. I have a master's degree in architecture from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where I was the teaching assistant under Dr. John Garner, who is no longer with the program, I understand, but ran that program for many years. I graduated in the historic preservation option of that program. And it was the 5 years I spent in Chicago were nothing compared to the 1 year I enjoyed spending down here in Urbana. So it was, and I've been back here many times. In fact, the year after I graduated, the year I graduated, I decided that one of the courses I had taken that spring was not well taught. So in my, I guess, youthful exuberance, I wrote a proposal that I come back and teach that course the following year, and it was accepted. So for about 9 years, I think, 1993 to 2001, something like that, I came back as a visiting professor. It was assistant professor, I believe, teaching a course in the Graduate School of Architecture under John Garner, which I enjoyed a great deal. So that is my background in my academic background. After graduating from the University of Illinois here in Urbana, I also received an offer to come interview for a position at the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, which is, as you know, the Illinois SHPO. I didn't really know very much about the SHPO, but I thought it was interesting, so I went and talked to them and decided that was probably a pretty good thing to do. Turned out to be one of the best jobs I ever had, because I spent a couple of years driving around the state of Illinois looking at old buildings and helping people preserve them. I worked on the various tax credit program, the tax freeze program. I worked with the National Register staff. I worked on Section 106 and other regulatory programs. But I essentially drove around the state from, in the south, it was probably Thebes Courthouse I had some involvement with, all the way up to some of the grand houses along the lakeshore of Chicago, all points in between, including the 1993 Mississippi floods in concert with the National Trust and FEMA. It was a great job, and I learned quite a bit about it, worked on many, many, many projects, and developed an excellent understanding of the administrative process and also the application of historic preservation laws at the time. A lot of what I did was evaluate properties for their compliance, rehab properties for their compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I went to graduate school at U of I because I, practicing as an architect, was involved with a project that involved the demolition of some historic, well, I don't know if they were legally historic, but they were some of the old buildings on my courthouse square in my hometown. I didn't feel very good about it, and I was found myself preparing the construction documents for a large building that, instead of having a number of buildings along a square, simply one large building was planted in its place, and decided that I thought I could do something a little better with my architectural career. And so at that point then, I've looked into the U of I program and went to that. But it was sort of my origin story in preservation had to do with the demolition of properties in my own hometown that I didn't feel good about, which got me into preservation. After leaving the IHPA, I went to law school in Chicago at Loyola, and while I was there, found myself kind of brought into some consulting matters with developers up in that area for various tax benefit projects that they were working on. Tax freeze, National Register, things like that. It was sort of unexpected, but some of the people I guess got to know at the state decided once I was out working for myself, they would like me to help them with that. When I became an attorney, then it sort of became a natural part of my practice, and working for law firms in Chicago, and even spent some time with a law firm in Florida. We worked on various historic preservation projects as a part of what I did, including some work down in the Art Deco section of Miami Beach, which was very interesting work for someone from the Midwest. So I tell you these things because I want you to know that I am an ardent supporter of historic preservation's goals, and I come at it probably a little bit differently because of my background as an architect and an attorney. A lot of the work I've done as an attorney is working with developers as well. And so a lot of way I look at historic preservation has to do with the economic sustainability of properties to encourage reinvestment. And I also look at sort of the a fair and transparent administrative process, and also the integrity of the landmarking process, because I feel that lowering the standards for landmarking renders that process meaningless. The truth is that very few old buildings can meet even a broad interpretation of most landmarking criteria, and I don't believe that property should be landmarked simply to prevent their demolition. So this kind of gives you the broad sense of what I've done. One of the things, though, that is relevant to where I'm going to talk about with the criteria has to do with the concept of plain writing, and I'll get into that in just a second. And when I was first starting out as an attorney, I represented a hotel in a historic tax credit matter. We did the application, went through the state, went through the feds, the National Park Service, and it was denied by the state. Well, the National Park Service then upheld the state's denial. The client asked me to take it on appeal, so we went to the Chief Appeals Officer in Washington, D.C., gave my presentation, and the argument was based simply on something that has since that time become federal policy. And it is that historic preservation laws, especially something like Secretary of the Interior standards, which, as you know, is a regulation, federal regulation, should be comprehensible to anyone. You should not require someone like me, or a lawyer, an architect, or anybody else to tell you what the law says. It should speak very plainly. I make this argument, I've made this argument for years, and although it would probably put me out of work, some work, I would be okay with that if the laws spoke more plainly to the public in a clear and unambiguous way. So we went to D.C., we did the appeal. There were about 9 points, I think, that they had denied the project on, 9 specific things. If this doesn't meet the standards, this doesn't meet, et cetera. You're familiar with all this, I know. And making the plain meaning argument, the Chief Appeals Officer, when they rendered their decision, reversed both the state and the National Park Service reviewers on 7 of those 9, so effectively saying they were wrong, and that their interpretation of the Secretary's standards on those 7 of those points simply did not meet any kind of plain meaning or plain writing or plain meaning standard. So that left 2 that we had to deal with, but 7 out of 9 wasn't bad. So I bring this up because I was asked to examine a lot of documents and then give my opinion on the criteria and specifically the application of this landmarking application to the criteria itself. But in 2010, Congress passed something called the Plain Writing Act of 2010, obviously, which mandated that federal agencies such as the U.S. Department of the Interior, which, as you know, includes the National Park Service, that they are required to communicate clearly with the public to better provide their services. President Obama, in Executive Order 13563, titled Improving Regulation and Regulatory Review, stated in part, "Our regulatory system must promote predictability and reduce uncertainty. It must ensure that regulations are accessible, consistent, written in plain language, and easy to understand." The City of Urbana is a certified local government. The Certified Local Government Program, as you know, is a creature. It was created by the 1980 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And it is a program administered by the National Park Service and state historic preservation offices that allow local governments, they work with local governments to create, among other things, local historic preservation commissions and ordinances. In effect, it's a federal exercise in creating a sort of national uniformity in ordinances and commissions and procedures. Now, I think it's a good program. And as you know, there are certain benefits to municipalities that participate in this. This is a federal program. I want to make that point very clear. The Plain Writing Act of 2010 only applies to federal agencies. There is not a direct mandate on local governments. However, the Plain Writing Act of 2010 clearly sets forth a policy statement that communicating with the public in its laws, and in historic preservation's case, its ordinances, must be plainly written so that the public can understand those, so that the entities can better provide their services. This is a policy, a federal policy. The Certified Local Government Program is a federal program, as I stated just a minute ago, of which the City of Urbana participates. It is my argument, my contention, that that policy should trickle down through the state and through the local level because of the entanglement, well, I say entanglement, the engagement of a local, of a CLG, a local CLG with the federal government through the National Park Service. the state, as you know, helps the Park Service administer this with the local governments. So I think that the policy of speaking and communicating clearly to the public at the federal level trickles down to the local level as well. And as again, there is no direct legal connection between those two, although there was in 2012, Plain Regulation Act of 2012 was proposed, which would have, I don't know the status of it right now, I think it's still in limbo, but it was much more, let's say, hands-on than the Plain Writing Act of 2010, because it would have required federal agencies essentially write their regulations in this same way. I don't know from the language how much they intended that it really goes back and revises past regulations, but clearly at the federal level there is an intent that federal agencies communicate very clearly with the public. Because of the City of Urbana's involvement with the Certified Local Government Program, I propose that its ordinance, which is a creature of that, I should say in part, probably a creature of that program, since as I understand, I wasn't involved with any of the process, but as I understand that ordinance of yours had to be approved by both the state and the National Park Service, I would say that federal policy trickles down to your ordinance as well. All right. So that is, well, and further along those lines, I think we've heard quite a bit of reference to National Park Service publications, applying the National Register standards. I believe in the staff opinion there was a reference to a preservation brief. And the preservation briefs are, as you know, publications, several dozen publications by the National Park Service that try to clarify the Secretary of the Interior standards, and I would contend, as I always have, that if the standards were written clearly, they wouldn't need interpretation. And yet there is quite a bit of energy put forth in writing about things like windows and brick. You'll never find the word window or brick in the Secretary of the Interior standards, so what you have is a National Park Service staff reading creatively into this very vague language of the standards to pull out some sort of meaning. That trickles down, obviously, to the local level because you refer to those documents. All right, so the two questions that I was asked, and this is in a report that is an exhibit to the memorandum that you received, and I know, so you'll see these. I was asked to address the issues of whether the property legally meets the ordinance's stated criteria for designation of a landmark, either by its express language or a plain meaning or plain language interpretation, and second point, whether the ordinance criteria are overly broad and vague aside from their specific application to the property. I have in the report addressed all 7 of the criteria. I know only 2 of them were included in the nomination, so I would ask you if you would like me to go through all 7, or I can go through the 2 and give my comments to those 2.
Just the 2 that are relevant, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. The other 5 are in the report. All right. Sorry?
In the report.
I'm sorry, yes. They're in the report. And so it's clear today, I'm giving notwithstanding my background as an architect, I'm an expert legal opinion witness today. Okay. Criteria A, again, the 2 points that I'm going to address on this is whether the property legally meets the ordinance's stated criteria, either by its express language or some plain meaning interpretation, and whether the ordinance criteria are overly broad. I will address both of those with each of criteria A, in both criteria A and C. Criteria A states into the ordinance, significant value as a part of the architectural, artistic, civic, cultural, economic, educational, ethnic, political, or social heritage of the nation, state, or community. My conclusion is the property does not meet criteria A. In a plain meaning interpretation of the criteria requires that a property has, quote, significant value of one or more than 9 enumerated elements of the property's heritage of the nation, state, or community. Since the application focused primarily on the architectural attributes and not any of the other 8, those terms are subtracted from criteria A to yield a plain writing interpretation of criteria A, which is simply that, as applies to this property, the criteria would be significant value as part of the architectural heritage of the nation, state, or community. Now, applying this to the property itself, I find that the property is in no way significant for its architectural features and therefore contributes nothing to the local, state, or national architectural heritage. Most of the features on this building, except for the gambrel roof, can be found on other period buildings of this era. The classical columns for the porch were very common starting in the 1890s after the Columbian Exposition of 1893 for several decades after that. The bays are common to Queen Anne's. The fan windows you can find in other styles. Dormers are common. So the only thing that I would say that makes this a Dutch colonial is, in fact, the gambrel roof. It lacks also many of the other features. The features that it does possess, and again, are found on the other. These are common features that are found in quite a few other building styles and are not unique as claimed in the application. For example, the dentils that are found in some of the cornice running around the building, those are found on many other building styles. And they are common to other contemporaneous building styles and not unique to the Dutch colonial revival. The actual physical condition of the property is significantly degraded and at odds with the condition claimed in the application. I did a walk around on the building and formed my own observations about that, so I'm not working just from photos. As the staff noted, the original front entrance steps have been replaced with blocky concrete steps inconsistent with the Dutch colonial revival style. The original double hung wood windows, which I assume multi-pane because that's, and I don't know this for sure, but I assume they were multi-pane because that's consistent with that style, have been replaced with new vinyl windows. A large contemporary outside stair was added at the east elevation, and better examples of the Dutch colonial revival style exist in an area that are not landmarked. So I don't believe that this property in any way is significant for its architectural features and therefore fails that part of, or that criteria A. I don't believe that anything I've heard here tonight would change that opinion. These are common features. The second part of this, that the criteria is overly broad and vague. One of the, as I alluded to earlier, one of the problems I've found over the years in preservation laws, local, state, or federal, is it relies on extremely vague and broad terms. And in doing so, rarely, if ever, defines those terms. In the ordinance itself, in criteria A, we have a couple of these that I've highlighted in my report, which are significant value, and then heritage. There is a definition section in the historic preservation section of the ordinance, but none of these, doesn't seem to be any attempt to define what significant means or what heritage means in that definition section. In fact, as far as I know, nowhere in historic preservation, a term significant, which is used about as much as any other term in historic preservation at the local, state, or federal level, 4 of the 5 National Register criteria all use significant, is not defined anywhere. No one has ever attempted to define it. Who knows what it means? I would ask, you could probably ask 5 people what it means and you get 5 definitions. You might just as well use awesome and you would probably get a better consensus on what that term means these days. So in the ordinance, you have undefined terms like significant value and heritage, and they have no real objective meaning by which a reasonable interpretation may be applied. The criteria also fails to establish a threshold for the significance of a property under consideration for landmarking, below which the property lacks significant value to be named a landmark, and above which the property may become a landmark. So not only is the significant term undefined, but there is no spectrum, no range below which something is not eligible, above which something is. Something may be a little significant, it may be a lot significant. This is never discussed. So this, in my opinion, is overly broad and vague. The same thing applies to the term heritage. It's also defined in the ordinance, and I'm not sure if this is synonymous with history, or does heritage imply certain subjective values? So that is my summary of criterion A, and again, I conclude that it fails. I agree with the staff that it fails this test and should not be, and does not meet criteria A. Criteria C stands in the ordinance stands as representative of the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type inherently valuable for the study of a period, style, craftsmanship, method of construction, or use of indigenous materials while retaining a high degree of integrity. Well, I guess criteria C requires that a property be an excellent example of a specific building type while retaining most of its original features in excellent condition. But instead of saying that, it sort of loads up a lot of terms which are difficult to really pull any objective meaning from. With a plain writing rewrite of that, and by the way, there are many, many ways to rewrite language. You could ask 5 people to take something like this, rewrite it, using plain language, and you would get 5 different versions. But hopefully, they would all be reduced, concise, and contain fewer subjective terms. So my take at it would be this criteria rewritten in a plain language, excuse me. It would be that it possesses the distinguishing architectural characteristics of a specific building type or style and retains the majority of its original architectural features in excellent condition. I think that embraces what was, it maybe have left out a few things like indigenous materials, but if it originally had indigenous materials, then I think it is covered. So as I discussed in criteria A, the property is an unexceptional example of the Dutch colonial revival style. It lacks, in fact, some of the distinguishing architectural features of the Dutch colonial revival style that are found in nearby houses, such as a symmetrical entry pediment with or without supporting porch columns, a well-expressed overhanging and flaring second floor, a gable end chimney flanked by the quarter-round windows, which, if anybody ever wants to know what a Dutch colonial is, look at the poster for the original Amityville horror movie in the 1970s. So you will know everything you need to know about that detail, which is a very common detail in Dutch colonial. This doesn't have that. Building length dormers are very common in this type. Again, the building does not have its original windows, and window shutters are also very common in this building type. Now, therefore, you know, my conclusion on this criteria is that it does not, it fails this criteria and does not possess the distinguishing architectural characteristics of a specific building type, and does not retain the majority of its original architectural features in excellent condition, which is my rewrite of what I believe the ordinance is trying to say in criteria C. The second part of that then is that this criteria, in my opinion, is overly broad and vague for the reasons I've discussed. And as an example, regarding the phrase inherently valuable for the study, I don't really know what that means. How is a property, quote, inherently valuable as opposed to simply valuable? And valuable to who? What does study mean in this context, and by who? This sort of language creates a barrier between the public and the preservation, I think, community in a lot of ways. When I say the public, I mean especially the owners and the investors, people who actually do put money into historic properties, and then sort of the preservation vernacular at the local, state, and federal level, which is fairly consistent. But there's a barrier, I think, in that the public cannot really understand what these ordinances are trying to say or what the requirements are, leaving it to quite a bit of subjectivity on the part of the reviewers, be it at the local, state, or federal level. And it's in my experience, both within preservation, working in state agencies, for nonprofits, been involved in preservation in academia, I see, and I've also been in the private investment sector, there is a sort of reluctance on the part of a lot of investors to put money into historic properties because of this kind of language. Now, and this is very common in every municipality, well, certainly the federal laws that I talked about earlier. This is the kind of language you'll find. It creates a barrier between the investment public, and when you don't have, people talk a lot about sustainability these days. When you're dealing with especially commercial historic buildings, there's only really one kind of sustainability, and that's that you need to be concerned about first. That's economic sustainability. And when you don't have, because of this kind of language, you have the uncertainty that this creates when you don't have investors coming in and investing in these properties. They don't survive. They were started as commercial vehicles, they must survive as commercial vehicles, or they go away. So this is a broader issue, but I'm applying it in this case because I think the ordinance is a sort of an example of the problem. And those were the two A and C that you asked me to comment on. The report does address the others in the same fashion, so you can see how I address these. All right?
So we'll postpone questions until after the next speaker.
So I do want to conclude
Unless
by
you
saying,
want
I just want to conclude by saying that
I'm
I had one wrap-up sentence. Sorry. The property meets, my opinion, my conclusion is that the property meets none of the criteria for landmark studies by any interpretation of the ordinance's language. And I agree with the Urbana Preservation staff that the application should be denied for landmark status. So that is my conclusion. And I thank you very much for your patience.
Commissioners, does anyone have a question for Mr. Cole? No, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We need just a brief recess.
Sure.
Of 3 minutes.
No problem.
And we'll be back.
No problem.
Thank you. All right, thank you for indulging us in a quick break. We resume with the opponent and the third representative of the property owner.
Thank you very much. I'd next like to introduce local architect Andrew Fell. As I said, a licensed architect working in Urbana-Champaign and that area. He is the architect that was retained by Mr. Hunsinger to plan for the improvement of the 611 Elm site, therefore has knowledge of the site itself. Maybe can get at some of the questions that were being asked earlier about the physical aspects of the building. We've also asked him to, in addition to telling something of his background and qualifications, describe the building, talk about what needs to be done. Here is the somewhat broader perspective that I would like you to hear. How is it usable? What needs to be done to it to make it rentable or usable? If it's not demolished, as would be required by the ordinance, what would have to be done to the property and what kind of costs would be involved? And then also a bit about the application of the Historic Preservation Ordinance as applied to this building, and generally as well, as Mr. Fell works in the community and is generally familiar with the way the ordinance works. So, Mr. Fell.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Fell, local architect. So, I think first to address the questions I was asked to present specific to this building about the condition of the property, the cost to renovate it, and that type of thing.
Your qualifications maybe first.
I'll get that. The property really isn't currently rentable in its current state. It's deteriorated quite a bit, not necessarily because of deferred maintenance, but mostly because the building's 110 years old, and due to its age, things just wear out, and it's hard to keep the maintenance up for that kind of thing. And again, with the periodic rental inspections, there are additional code compliance items that Neighborhood Services requires to be done, and it just becomes eventually an insurmountable task to keep up with that type of maintenance. So in order to really make it rentable, it needs the roof structure is in poor condition. It sags. The rafters are 2x4s, 24 inches on center, which in 1902 was fine. In 2016, it's not fine. So it needs a whole new roof, probably all new roof sheathing. There are some other structural issues in the building. There are code issues simply because of the way the building codes have changed over the years. So if the property isn't demolished, really the highest and best use for it would be to turn it into a duplex. Simply because as an existing 6-bedroom house, it can't be rented to 6 people, so we need to divide it so it can be higher and better use. So in order to meet the current building code with that type of change, essentially you have to gut the entire inside of the building out because it doesn't meet current energy codes, doesn't meet electrical codes or anything of that nature. It's balloon frame, so we have to fire block all the framing. In addition to that, all the services have to be separated out to the different tenants, so it would need a whole new electrical service, 2 new furnaces, some of the plumbing has to be separated out. So I won't go through the bullet point list. I think you have it in your packet of the major items that need to be addressed for that renovation, but it comes out to a little bit over $300,000 to renovate that property as is, not as a landmark building. If it's a landmark building, that cost escalates substantially because the exterior can't be sided over with a different material. We would presumably need to match the materials. It's expensive materials. The labor is extremely expensive to do that. The next sort of big item is what needs to happen if it goes back to being a single-family residence. Again, it's really not habitable well as a single-family residence now. So our estimation is that it would need about $100,000 work minimum to make it even livable as a single-family residence. We have all the same structural issues we have to deal with. We wouldn't necessarily have to do as major amount of mechanical work and things like that, but there's still a major amount of work that needs to be done. And again, if it's designated a landmark, that cost goes up again significantly. And I think Mr. Whitsitt will comment to the fact that this property can't support that kind of investment as a single-family residence or even as a remodeled as a duplex. It's not an economically viable option. to get to a couple other points specifically about this, the way the ordinance works is, I lived in this neighborhood for 16 years, renovated a house, and love the neighborhood. So I'm certainly not averse to the historic nature of the neighborhood. My firm does a great deal of historic preservation work, lots of work on historic buildings and old buildings. We have 12 PAC awards hanging on our wall. And we're currently retained by some owners in St. Louis to renovate a large landmark building in a national historic district, because this is the kind of work we're good at and this is the kind of work we do. So I don't come to the table as an opponent of the historic nature of anything. I mean, we're known regionally for being good at this kind of work. The owner of this property is simply trying to redevelop his property by rights under all the existing ordinances and codes. We met every single criteria of the MOR district. That was approved. We asked for no variances, no concessions, and only after his plans were I'll say made public because your commission was notified, because at the MOR district, was this property even considered for landmark status. To me, that means your commission is becoming a solely reactive tool to development. There's nothing proactive about this process at all, and that's what your commission should be. All you are right now is a reactive arm to halt any development in the city of Urbana. Any individual can stop development at their own discretion. And that's not what your commission should be about. It totally undermines your purpose, in my opinion. So if this building, if it deserves landmark status today, it deserved it last year, and 5 years ago, and 10 years ago. It's not worthy of landmark status simply because somebody wants to redevelop the property in another way. Again, your credibility is diminished simply by even entertaining this kind of nomination. I have other clients, 2 in particular, that are considering doing very large projects in Urbana, multi-million-dollar projects, and they're watching this hearing. They want to see how this sort of plays out, because if this is the kind of environment that they have to wade through to do their projects, they're going to sell their property and build elsewhere because they can't afford to go through an entire rental cycle wading through this process. So a few years ago, your commission came out with the list of the 100 most notable important, I don't know what it's called, important buildings in Urbana. So at the very most, this building is number 101. I doubt if it's 101, but it might be. And the way that list was formulated was criteria almost parallel to what determines what a landmark building is. Now, Urbana has, I believe, 16 landmark properties currently. Ironically, 2 of those were nominated under this exact same process, where I, as the architect, had a project in the MOR district. The Historic Preservation Commission was notified of that project, and I believe it was the morning before the MOR meeting, those 2 buildings were nominated to be landmark properties by the same petitioner, exactly for the same reason, to halt development. Now, of the 16 landmark properties in Urbana, 8 of those on your list of 100 most important buildings. In my opinion, the other 92 should be landmark properties before number 101. So I think that in a way this process is flawed and something needs to be done to correct it, to make it fair and reasonable. I don't know what that answer is, but allowing the process to take place this way fails your mission. And that. So I'll take any questions you have.
Are there any questions for Mr. Fell?
I have one. Are there currently, in the plans that you have envisioned, is there currently any office space as part of this new structure?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
Mr. Woodson. Finally, I'd like to introduce Steve Whitsitt, who's a local commercial appraiser, real estate appraiser, but licensed as a general appraiser. Has an MAI designation. He'll tell you more about his background, his qualifications. We asked him to take the information that had been provided by Mr. Hunser and Mr. Fell as to costs that were being incurred, to look at the economic viability of the kind of development that would exist either with the landmark designation or without the designation, asking him more specifically to look at the tell you about the appraisal process, factors considered, his opinion as to highest and best use, what would happen if we demolish the house and redevelop the property in that regard, what would the value of the property be under its highest and best use, both as a landmark designation and without a landmark designation, and then its feasibility as a economic operation if the kind of money Mr. Fell was talking about was put into the building to improve it if the landmark designation is provided. Mr. Whitsitt.
Thank you. Well, as David mentioned, my name is Steve Whitsitt. I'm licensed as an Illinois Certified General Appraiser. I'm also licensed as an Illinois broker. I hold the MAI and SRA designations with the Appraisal Institute, and I've written and taught a class for continuing education for the state on understanding cap rates, and I taught at Parkland for 15 years on appraising the single-family residence. I have an appraisal firm in Champaign where there are 6 appraisers and 2 staff, so we do a volume of work. And for full disclosure, I was a former resident of the West Urbana neighborhood, and we remodeled 602 West Oregon in the mid-'80s, where we brought it back to its original style with a 5-color paint job, so I appreciate your role in this process. I was asked to measure the economic impact an historic landmark designation would have on the subject property. To do that, I used a highest and best use study. I reviewed empirical evidence recognizing a sale of a designated historic landmark property, and I identified the economic viability of remodeling the property under historic landmark designation. When I talk about a highest and best use study, the methodology includes recognizing the land as a vacant and the land as currently improved under the criteria of what's physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and maximally productive. In that regard, I analyzed a variety of multifamily sites that would overlap the highest and best use allowed within the MOR district and concluded a site value of $275,000. You should have the sales and the procedure in your packet. To compare that with the property as improved, I analyzed the existing dwelling based on other rental house sales and concluded a value of $155,000, which recognizes its size, location, and more importantly, its condition. In the same vein, I identified what the value would be to an investor from a return perspective. Small multifamily properties are valued based on a gross income multiplier analysis, which recognizes the mathematical relationship between price and income. When you divide the sale price of a property by its income, you get a number, which is known as a gross income multiplier. My concluded value, using the gross income multiplier analysis, was $130,000. So the value of the house as it sits is between $130,000 and $155,000. I concluded $145,000. That's significantly lower than the $275,000 site value, which from a highest and best use analysis perspective suggests that it's beyond the point of being an interim use. The highest and best use is to redevelop the site. That's due in part to the condition of the property and in part to the escalation of site values for on campus for multifamily properties. Regarding the empirical evidence, a property at 801 West Oregon was acquired in 2014, I believe, and I had the opportunity to reappraise it a year later and found that it sold at a price 32% less than what it would be valued at, recognizing a new income stream. And so my question to the buyer of the property is, why did it sell so cheap, and why did you buy it? Why would you buy it if you're handcuffed by the historic landmark designation? He said it was strictly a relationship to price. There wasn't demand for it because of the designation. He acquired at what he thought was a good price and saw an opportunity to make money. Finally, I reviewed Andrew Fell's costs from a remodeling perspective and analyzed them in relationship to the income the property would throw off to see how viable that is. At an income of $22,800 and the remodeling costs, including the site value, when brought to historic landmark designation status, would require a gross income multiplier of 27.5. In our marketplace, within your packet, I extracted two multipliers. One, I believe, was 7. One was 7.2. So the multipliers that are typically realized for small multifamily properties in our marketplace tend to start at 6 or 7. Brand new buildings that have a lot of amenities and are well located might be 9 or 10, but there's nothing as high as 27 times gross. So that illustrated to me the fact that it's not economically feasible to view the property as an investment, and it should be raised and redeveloped from an economic perspective. That's a real quick summary of what I attempted to, how I attempted to answer the question that was posed to me. Do you have any questions?
I think I do. So are you saying that that lot is worth $275,000, just the lot?
I'm suggesting that as a multifamily parcel within the MOR zoning, it should command $40 per square foot. There was a lot 2 or 3 blocks away that was $100 a square foot. It was B3U. And there was another lot in the same neighborhood that sold, I think, 3 years ago for $26 a square foot. Yes, it's my opinion that the land would bring $40 a square foot, which is slightly more than $275,000. But when you look at land, you look at something that's a turnkey development parcel. And to do that, you'd need to tear the building down. And I estimated about $15,000 to tear the building down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you say the property values were increasing, in your opinion, in that area as a result of development on campus?
Campus land prices, campus land prices have gone up. There hasn't been much new development in Urbana to gauge it from a multifamily perspective. Most of the new development on campus has been in Champaign.
I just got confused because you were talking about the site value, and then you mentioned multifamily properties, and then an increase in property values, and I had missed your connection there. So would you restate that for us?
Urbana has a couple of challenges, one of which is the historic landmark designation. An investor doesn't want to deal with the hurdles associated with not being able to remodel the property except to the requirements required by the designation. They don't want to have their bundle of rights limited. They don't want to have the ability to do what they want with it, including tear it down, limited. Urbana also has a significantly higher tax base. They have a rental registration program that is a little more invasive. So investment in Urbana is more challenging. And multifamily property prices in general absolutely have gone up. And home values in Urbana have gone up. I don't appraise houses, my staff does. But I know the multifamily properties in Urbana that are not hindered on redevelopment generally have gone up. As interest rates have declined, cap rates are tied to interest rates, and the lower the rate, the higher the value. So as interest rates have been stable the last few years, prices have gone up.
I'd like to ask too, you used the term in terms of best use or highest and best use, the term maximally productive.
Yes.
Can you help us understand what that means from your perspective in the industry within which you work?
That's appraisal jargon.
Which
which essentially means what gives you the highest return. What gives you the highest return to the property?
guess I have one more question. So we're talking about the possibility, and this really has nothing to do with the landmarking, but the proposed replacement for this property would be, I believe, a 5-unit building. We've got hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of units being built in Champaign-Urbana, a lot of them in Urbana. So I'm wondering if we think these 5 additional units somehow are going to increase the economic stability of Urbana. In other words, is there so much property being built? Now, I've heard stories of properties like the property going up on Healy was originally going to be a lot bigger, and it downsized because the demand, because the supply is outweighing the demand. So I guess I'm just, as an appraiser, asking you if you have any sense of that.
It's a scary marketplace. It's something we haven't encountered before. I've done work in Charleston, and Eastern Illinois University went from 12,000 students to 8,000 students, and it's scary. And to attract students, you need to keep reducing your rent to the point where you're going to be full. We've seen a little bit of that in our marketplace, and I speak more to the Champaign market, where a majority of my work comes from. But I think across the board, campus landlords are nervous, and they're worried about achieving a return commensurate with cost. To add 5 units to this property, that's a pretty low density, and the return associated with those 5 units probably wouldn't, it's beyond the scope of what I analyzed, but I don't know whether it would fully recapture the cost of development or not. I've seen the other buildings that Mr. Hunziker's put up, and they look like houses. They look like nice houses. So I was frankly a little surprised that individuals would rather look at a blighted property that needs either repaired or torn down than a new one that can be architecturally pleasing. And I can't speak to the finished product because that was beyond the scope of what I'm doing, but it is a scary marketplace, and I think most investors are concerned, to answer your question. Yeah.
Mr. Whitsett, have you been to the property?
I have.
Okay. And I recognize that you don't provide all of the appraisals for residential structures.
Right.
Can you give us an understanding of about how long some of these characteristics of the property, which you're claiming have been in decay or deterioration, I think was the term that you used, significant deterioration?
Actually, I took a lot of pictures, and it should be in what you have.
Yeah, no, and I'm seeing some of those.
Yeah, and they have interior and exterior photographs. The exterior painting of it, the exterior of the property obviously needs scraped and repainted. A lot of the trim is rotted and needs replaced. The window sills are rotted. There were holes in the ceiling on the upper floor, which suggests roof damage. I am not an architect nor a structural engineer, and so I rely on information provided by others when it comes to structural damage. But what I observed was an HVAC system that didn't appear to work or was defunct, a roof that was questionable, windows that needed replaced, paint on the interior and exterior, plaster and drywall repair. The flooring needs repaired in some areas. Mr. Hunziker had prepared for demolition and taken down the kitchen cabinets. They could have probably been put back up, and you would have a kitchen of some level of functionality, but it wasn't when I was there. So when I look at a lot of student housing, and it is amazing how bad some of the houses can be. But this I didn't view as habitable. I didn't view it as leasable. I asked Mr. Hunziker, in his estimation, what's the minimum you'd have to spend to clean it up, to repair it, to have a student live there. He suggested $15,000 for the bare minimum, which was one of the adjustments I used in my analysis. Obviously, the high end of that would be the $352,000 that Andrew Fell identified to convert it into a duplex. So, does that answer your question?
To a degree, can you tell us or make your best guesstimate as to how long some of these elements of deterioration have been in progress?
Well, the rotted trim has probably been going on, I would assume, for 10 years or longer. I know water, you know, once the water starts to damage things, it's over a period of time. We learned that at our house at 602 West Oregon, that, you know, over time things do just wear out. I don't know how long the roof's been bad or the HVAC's not been functional, how long the hole's been in the ceiling, and it was a big hole. You have a picture of it. I'm assuming this has been over at least the last 5 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from commissioners?
And we kind of went ahead with questions, so should I open it up for the others who spoke in case
Well,
anybody wants to speak?
I'll see. Do we want to call back any of
Because
the last?
The last two really went ahead and answered
Yeah.
questions. but-
Does anybody have? No? No? Okay. Then, next, the nominator has the right to ask questions. Mr. Adams, and
I'll be allowed to make some concluding remarks, is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Dr. Adams, Dr. Apple, do you have any questions of the opposition? No. Okay. Okay. Then next, we have time for others in opposition to the application to speak. So, would you like to make summary comments now while you're there?
I'll wait till after.
Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak in opposition to the application? There being none?
Okay.
Um,
Do I go first?
Well, let me check on that. It actually, Lori, can I have clarification? I mean, it just states that the nominator can make summary comments, but
I believe it was the intent that the opponent would make the comments as part of his presentation.
Okay.
So it could have been allowed earlier.
okay, but we can still do it now,
That's correct, yes.
can't we? Would you like to make summary comments now? Yeah.
I'd be glad to. I won't add much. I want to make sure that the materials that we've presented, which include the staff report, include the written reports of the people who spoke, will become part of the record as well as the testimony that we've heard.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll just conclude by springing off of Mr. Whitsett's comments. What you're being told, and of course his comments are based upon what the others have said, is that there's a chance that if the demolition can't take place and if the redevelopment can't take place as was originally planned, that the property will sit there unoccupiable, or maybe with a few dollars spent, will be part of a slum. Now, that's an extreme comment to make, but that's kind of what they're saying. And I say it in that extreme way to make the point that nobody you've heard from, and certainly not Mr. Hunsinger or his family, opposes the idea of protecting the past or preserving architectural specimens, really, or achieving many of the goals expressed in the ordinance. But it's the burden of the proponent to show that this meets the criteria of the ordinance. And it is not that any property in Urbana that is the subject of an application is eligible for landmark status. There's a balancing process that goes on, and that's first your job and then also the city council, of course, to do that in a way that recognizes not only the goals of the ordinance, but also some of the impositions that will take place with regard to the owner. And it's in that regard that we've broadened the spectrum of the kind of evidence that we've tried to show you to include some aspects of the economic viability of what's going on here, to have you understand that it is not a question of just one redevelopment versus a little bit better redevelopment. It's a question of whether this property will ever be used again. And Mr. Hunsinger, who has a reputation for great care when it comes to the developing that he does, it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but I know that I believe that as a landlord, he's well respected. This is the kind of landlord that we want in Urbana. And if you know anything about the other properties that he's developed, you'll find, I believe, that in spite of the fact that he's making a living doing this, that he would not willy-nilly tear something down that really could work. This property can't work. It may, by somebody's interpretation of what is a very vague ordinance, as Mr. Cole described, it may meet some criteria, but as an economic entity, it won't work. And so we respectfully ask that you recommend to the City Council that that the request be denied. Thank you and I didn't say earlier, as I wanted to, thank you very much for your time and for allowing Mr. Hunsinger and really all of us here. I know this is public service for you, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, do you have any concluding comments that you would like to make? No? Okay. All right, so we're finished with audience participation at this point, and we're ready for discussion. Oh, yes. Oh. I should note that the previously mentioned email copy was given to us, the one that Gina presented from Eric Jacobson, just for the record.
Is there any way that we can get some of this information a little earlier? Like this, I mean, it's a very well written document, what I read of it, but I could not get through the whole document submitted this afternoon. Yeah, but some of us have a job and we can't do it in the afternoon. That's the problem. Right, and I appreciate that, but.
Could I go? First of all, I have a question for staff, I guess. I think I heard the gentleman from Chicago, I'm not good with names, as he linked our historic preservation ordinance to the Secretary of the Interior standards, say that the ordinance was reviewed and okayed by the National Park Service. Is that a fact?
Not one that I'm aware of, but we can certainly look into that.
Okay, I mean, I would just be...
I think what he meant was because we applied to be a certified local government, then the Historic Preservation Agency had to review our ordinance to be sure that it had certain qualities that they expect CLGs to have. And so indirectly, we might assume that since IHPA oftentimes represents the National Park Service in Section 106 or not Section 106, but in 20% tax credit and other activities, that's filtered down to the local level. So as part of a certified local government, we did have our ordinance reviewed.
Yeah, okay. So can I just make a couple of general comments?
I'd like to go back
how do you want to start this?
I'd like to go back to Kim's issue then.
The only reason I said that was that I want to make sure that you get all the consideration that you need, that we have all the information. I mean, I was getting emails from proponents and opponents throughout the afternoon, and it'd be nice if there was a time period maybe that all this information can be collected and that we would have time to review it and to really consider all of the...
We are unable to give a deadline because as a public hearing, everything that you hear through when you close that public hearing is for your consideration.
May I ask a question of Mr. Thies? Okay. If you could come up to the microphone again so that we're on the record. Sorry to do that for you. We didn't get the electronic version until sometime mid-afternoon to late afternoon. Would you say that because the three people who were represented in the document, we also did get a hard copy for the meeting tonight as well, would you say that their testimony tonight adequately represented what we got in the electronic document this afternoon and in the document this evening that we have as a paper copy?
The electronic document and the hard copy is
It's the same.
It's the same thing, but they were summarizing it in their verbal presentation. So obviously we asked them to make the main points. There would be other things, also statistics, photos, explanation of how Mr. Witzik got to the values, to those kinds of things he didn't talk about. But so I don't want to say it's the.
Well,
it was represented by what they said. That's
Okay.
that's certain.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So are you trying to say, is that a problem? I mean, we have a good representation from their presentations that.
Well, I've just, you know, I mean, one option, if other commissioners feel the same way, that you haven't had a chance to review the material, one option is to continue the hearing, correct?
It's a hefty document, and there's a lot of good information in there, and I would value additional time. If I need to make a decision tonight, I can do so based on the testimony that was given and what I've been able to read, but additional time would be valuable.
Gina?
I was lucky enough to have the afternoon off, so I was able to go through most of the document. Not all of it, but most of it.
Oh, well, I have a strong opinion on that. And that is that most of the 244 pages submitted don't mean anything to us in the context of whether we render a decision about the denial or the acceptance of the application for historic preservation status. Although and I'm reading now as I've taken notes here, although, I mean, I accept the plain language argument that was made, it has no bearing on what we do tonight. We either operate underneath the ordinance that we have as it's spoken to the best of our ability, or we fold up and go home. Although I appreciate the detailed analysis, legal and financial, and I'm hoping that the whole reason for the 244-page document is so that it will be officially inserted into a record that the city council will take into consideration, which seems to me to be plain to all of us. We can't use any of this. And I just read the ordinance, at least skimmed the portions of it germane to the argument I'm going to make now, and that is that the ordinance does not factor beyond the Secretary of Interior standards that we've all been talking about for the last going on 3 hours. The balancing of takings versus preservation benefits is not specifically allowed by the ordinance that we operate under. So again, in my mind, we either go forward or fold. We don't have a viable historic preservation ordinance in Urbana, and that's the end of that. So I mean, I may have been the first one to comment to staff, whoa, 244 pages. But I mean, when you look at that, you will see that there are these very valuable and succinct arguments related to financial and legal that I just kind of reviewed a bit or mentioned or wanted to bring out as a valuable contribution, really. And then the rest of it is just a repeat of the application. There are some valuable pictures from Mr. Witzik. I appreciated those. But again, I don't think they're germane to the decision that we need to make tonight. The question in my mind then becomes, at 10 o'clock, after doing this for 3 hours, does the commission, do the members have the ability to then toss all of this stuff aside and try to narrow, focus, and discuss on whether or not we think this criteria, in the absence of all of the flurry that we've had, whether this house meets these two criteria. just to tell you where I am with that part of it, I'm, in fact, I think in agreement with city staff that there are significant modifications that may have been made to the structure. Category 1 seems like a real stretch. I'd remind us all that we're not talking about a landmark district designation. For better or for worse, we're talking about a single building designation. And though I appreciate all the concerns voiced about the West Elm neighborhood, they in fact shouldn't impinge on the decision that we make tonight. So I guess that's my challenge to us all, and I'll be quiet for a while. So thanks.
Well, I guess we're sitting on the opposite ends of the table in more ways than one there. Yeah, and while I respect the nature of the language that we are tasked to follow, and I do agree with you, Scott, that we need to consider what's in front of us. I don't think we can consider the structure without looking at the broader picture of the neighborhood. I don't think that's possible. Otherwise, we have pristine little perfect examples of architecture that tell none of the local history story. I mean, that's on the extreme end is where I'm making that argument from. So I think to some degree we do have to consider the bigger picture in that regard. And I think there's grounds for it in the 1998 Urbana Historic Preservation Plan. It says our job is to promote economic development by encouraging investment in historic resources and preserving the character of neighborhoods. And it's from that the Historic Preservation Commission is derived. And so I think kind of the strict construction approach to it may be a little bit too narrow in that regard. So that's where I'm coming from in asking for maybe a little bit more time or the consideration of such.
If we did approve a continuance, then we would do this again, open this up again at our next meeting, next regularly scheduled meeting.
Yes, another option would be to do it 2 weeks from tonight on the 20th. As a special
and then
meeting.
we pick up the hearing at this point of commission discussion then.
That's correct.
The sooner the better in my opinion. I think everyone needs to go on with life here, and we can't. It's not right to make people wait even longer for us to come to a decision. However, more time to do so could.
I think we would be wise to, and I am sorry for members of the audience who spent hours here tonight along with us, but I think it's clear that some need more time for consideration. So I would encourage us to approve a continuance to.
Would you check the dates that they're okay with the petitioner as well as the opponent before making that final decision?
Mm-hmm. If we were to continue the hearing until Wednesday the 20th.
Well, Mr. Witzett's not here that night. I think everyone else of our group is. So my fear would be if there were a question that would be directed to him, maybe if we could know about it so I could arrange for some sort of a written.
Or what's the next date for the next Wednesday then?
That's the February. Let's look.
The 27th, this room's not open.
Correct. So it'd be the next regularly scheduled meeting on the 3rd of February.
Mr. Witzett's already run the gauntlet as well.
Oh.
By comparison, so.
Well, if the commission has time to consider if they would have questions for Mr. Witzitt, then submitting them in advance, and then you could respond to those is a perfectly acceptable way to do that, if you think you could have those in advance.
Ms. Pearson, what would the process be for doing so?
You would email staff individually.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, the date again is the 27th or the 20th, did you say?
20th.
20th.
Yeah.
So are you checking the room?
No.
Oh.
The room, well, I don't know if the room's here on the 20th, but I sit on another board that meets here the 27th.
Yeah, the room.
I know.
Dr. Adams, are
available.
you able to come on the 27th?
20th.
20th. Sorry.
2 weeks.
Okay. I don't know.
They would be able to, provided they reviewed the material such as this video in advance.
Can you,
I would like to motion that we continue this meeting to the 20th
is there a second?
of January, yes, 2016.
Are we continuing the meeting or just the case?
Just the case, the public hearing.
Okay, then I'd revise that to request that we continue the public hearing to the 20th of January.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Do we need to have roll call for the? Yeah. No.
Voice vote is adequate.
Okay. All those in favor of continuing the public hearing until January 20th signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Note that Mr. Dossett has opposed. Motion carries. We're going to postpone the hearing then until the 20th. All right, so we do have more meeting now. Yes, I hear groaning. Sorry. No, and we won't talk about the subject or anything, so, okay. You're good.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you all.
Next item on the agenda is old business, and we have none. There are no new public hearings, fortunately. No new business. And next we have monitoring of historic properties. We have the Urbana Free Library listed.
Yes, we did receive an inquiry from a commissioner about work that they heard would be happening at the library. I did speak to Catherine Wicks, the Associate Director of the Urbana Free Library, about that work, and she provided the following statement. Basically, she indicates that the library's foundation promoted their annual campaign during the month of December, which is what you heard. The foundation helps provide funding for library projects that otherwise might not take place, such as upgrades to or renovation of the library HVAC system, the Ray Street front porch, and the windows in the 1819 part of the building. Projects that have been in the library's 5-year financial plan since 2006. At this time, the library is only in the early stages of the discussion about the potential projects. So very early stages.
So they don't have anything specific they can tell us about the porch, what they envision for the porch?
They are still, it's my understanding, they're still looking at past information about that porch, so they might need more evaluations of it. But obviously, since 2006, needed work has been identified, but the funding sources have not been. So
okay.
That's all I have.
Okay, any other buildings? Yes.
Yeah, I think we all got an email today about the Buena Vista thing, and you kind
Yes.
of touched on it, Lori. So I noticed that there's already a bus stop there, but the person that sent the email seems to think they're going to be putting up a shelter for that bus stop. So can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I spoke to the MTD about this, and they would be relocating. I have an image. Let's see. Where is it? So basically, they would be relocating a bus stop from in front of this building right here. There's a bus stop. They'd be relocating it to here. And basically, the reason they're doing that is because the sidewalk over here is really narrow. It's hard, especially for people in wheelchairs, to get off there. Over here would be wider. They'd put in a concrete pad, and it would make getting on and off the bus a lot easier. So they'd be moving it 200 feet from here to here.
So, I do remember the email from the group. Did they say that their concern was that they thought it was going to be on the property, or that it was somehow disturbing the view shed of the property, or?
Yeah.
Yes, mostly the view.
So there is currently a sign there.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's
I drove by
there's currently a bus stop right here.
No,
Yeah.
I drove by Buena Vista today, and there is a MTD sign right in front of it.
Oh, right here.
It looks pretty new to me. I don't know if
Yeah.
it looked new to you,
Yeah.
but
Then
I
maybe-
think it is the new bus stop,
And
the
it's
concrete
right
pad will
in the
follow.
front, right in the center of, I mean, it's on the right of way, but it
Mhm.
is right in the center of
Okay.
Buena Vista. So, so do we think that there's not going to be a shelter?
There's
This is
not going
it?
to be. There's not going to be a shelter.
There's really no room there. It's a very narrow parkway.
So can we just ask staff to work with Ms. Wachter to make sure she understands this, and if a pad and a sign bothers her, she should bring that back to us?
I don't think it was just that. I
Right.
think it was security too,
Right.
that they're concerned about people cutting through Buena
Right.
Vista Court.
To get there.
To get to the bus stop.
Rather than cutting through the parking lot next door, which is also private property, or, somehow getting around to that spot.
Does the sign itself pose an imposition for people who have seen it?
It's right next to the street sign. It is about as inconspicuous as one can be and still serve the purpose of a bus stop sign.
So then the sidewalk is wider where it is now? You mentioned it was narrower in
I
the...
think the issue was that the parkway, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, the parkway was narrower in its old position, so you couldn't have enough space for the concrete pad, a wheelchair, and the bus, the kneeling bus. It wasn't good for maneuverability.
I will say that at a minimum, it would have been nice for somebody from MTD to work with the neighbors, on some kind of basis. So I don't know if there's some way we can, do they just?
Well, I will say that the adjacent property is actually City of Urbana property, so had they reached out to an adjacent property owner, it would have
you
been
guys.
to us.
Yeah.
And then also separating Buena Vista Court from that property is an old right-of-way, which is not really a street anymore, but it's pretty well removed from Buena Vista Court, so I can't imagine that they would have thought, oh, we should talk to those people because it is so far removed.
Okay.
We appreciate her contact, certainly.
Yeah.
and If there's more we can do in the future, if she doesn't find this acceptable, maybe she come on in. Let's share with us. Yeah, we're glad to hear it.
Any other monitoring? Yes, Gina.
Yeah, I had one more. So I saw an estate sale sign on Vine maybe 3 weeks or so ago, and said, "Oh, estate sale, gotta go." It's 702 East California, which is one of the two blighted properties that there was some concern about quite a few months back. So 702 East California has been purchased by a local realtor who will be flipping it. I did walk through it. It definitely needs a lot of work. But, hopefully he'll do a sensitive flip, but we'll see.
I finally turned over last year's survey forms to Kevin a couple of weeks ago, and there is a survey form on that property.
Correct. Yeah.
A well-done survey form, as I recall.
Yes.
Right, so
So if the
it definitely
property-
needs a lot of love. I mean, I walked
Is
through
there
it.
any way we
and
can
it was-
provide that to the new owner, or
I'm sorry?
I'm sure we could, yeah.
I have his name at home. I have his card at home.
the realtor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's JICTB. Is that what it was? That's who the property owner is listed as. Or did somebody buy it
Somebody bought it,
from? Okay.
yeah, from
Okay.
the old, from the trust.
Yes.
'Cause it was
Or
on- it was in a
whatever-
trust.
Whatever it was.
Right, 7-Eleven's in the same trust.
Okay.
So I found out from a coworker who used to live at 706 that 702, 704, and 711 were all owned by the same family.
Oh.
And they're all in the same trust, but 702 was recently purchased. So I just thought I'd let you guys know that, the front of it's unboarded, and I don't know what his time frame is, but
Good.
he's planning on flipping it.
Okay, Matt, did you have something?
Well, a long time ago, we brought up the Mumford House, and I don't know that we've ever came up with a response to the daughter of the former owner, I believe it was, that had sent us an email, but I just want to bring that back on the radar, that maybe we can talk about that next time.
Yeah.
Because she had raised
Yeah.
some concerns about it, and
Speaking of next time, do we have a regular meeting next time, or will we still have our we'll just do the public hearing?
Well, if there's other agenda items that you wanted to put on that other meeting,
And then
there's
do
no
we
problem
still
with
have
that.
our February meeting a couple of weeks after that?
If there are items or you
I
have
see.
a desire to meet?
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
I was just going to say, yeah, maybe when I have brain power again,
Okay.
we can talk
All right.
about that.
All right, staff report? No, can't blame you for that. No study sessions, any announcements?
I have one.
Yes.
The city, this is maybe a little far afield, but we've been far afield all night. The city has selected a contractor to develop the 200 South Vine property right across from the federal courthouse. The Historic East Urbana Neighborhood Association is hosting a discussion and meeting about interfacing that building with the residences on the other side of Urbana Street, and some of our concerns at the Urbana Free Library in the Lewis Auditorium at 7:15 on the 14th of January this month. So 14th of January this month. I'll be leading that discussion along with some other people, staff, hopefully from community development will be there. But it's a big thing for our little, our side of Vine Street to happen. And it's probably, I'm guessing, is going to actually serve as some kind of a model for not only the 200 South Vine, but also the 100 South Vine block. That being where Dino Tune and the oil change place are now, as you look several years down the road. And so it's not part of our special design review area, which we have in the neighborhood, but it's certainly pertinent to staff efforts to develop downtown design review overlay and that development in our part of town. So anyone who's interested, the 14th of January this month, I believe that's a Thursday. I
What
lost
time?
my calendar. Thursday, the 14th, 7:15 at the Lewis Library, Lewis Auditorium at the Urbana Free Library.
Thank you for all the
Thank
work
you.
you've done
Yeah.
and continue to do to promote that, because that was an issue for us in 2015, and you really have done a lot to help move that forward. So thanks for doing that.
Sure, you're welcome.
Any other announcements?
Yeah, I've got one blurb. The Landmarks Illinois, every year they do a series where they nominate the most endangered historic places in the state of Illinois. The deadline for that, and that can be right here in Urbana. So if you think some place is endangered and it's one of the most endangered places in the state, go to landmarks.org is their website. The public nominations deadline is Monday, January 11th.
Okay, thank you. All right, motion to adjourn, anybody?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned, thank you.